In a hall in Iceland in the year 1220, somewhere in the early decades of that century, a man sat down at a desk and began to write. His name was Snorri Sturluson. He was an educated man, a politician, a chieftain, a believer in the Christian God, and he was about to decide, through the act of writing, what the Norse pantheon would become to every generation that followed. Everything you are about to hear begins with this moment, not with Odin's first breath, not with the slaying of Ymir, but with Snorri Sturluson's choice to set quill to parchment and render the old pagan myths into a Christian-era book. That book did not invent the pantheon, but it decided which version of the pantheon would survive. And that decision, made more than 8 centuries ago by one man in one room in one island, is the frame you must hold for everything that follows. Here is the hard truth about the Norse gods. None of them exist without text. Not one. The gods of Egypt live in hieroglyphs carved in stone. The gods of Greece survive in pottery shards and temple ruins, and the verses of Homer. The gods of Rome were recorded in formal histories by men who watched them fade. But the Norse gods, Odin, Thor, Freyja, and all the rest, they survived only because, after the pagan age ended and the last temples were burned, some poems remained. Those poems were gathered, bound, copied by the hands of Christian scribes who knew they were preserving a dead religion. And then, almost by accident, those manuscripts persisted into the modern world. Without that chain of choices and accidents, you would not be hearing this. Without that fragile line of monks and scholars and the luck of preservation, the entire Norse pantheon would exist in the same hazy region as 10,000 other dead religions, known to have happened, impossible to know fully. So understand, the pantheon you will meet exists only because these stories were written down. Everything else, everything that was called on, invoked, lived with, has become invisible to us because it never quite made the jump into narrative, never quite became a story worth preserving in ink. There were 2 texts. The first was very old. It survives as what scholars call the Codex Regius, a medieval Icelandic manuscript, bound and copied by hands unknown, preserved by the accident of fate. Inside that manuscript lie the poems we now call the poetic Edda, Völuspá, the Song of the Sibyl, Havamal, the words of the High One, Grimnismal, the Lay of Grimnir. These are the voices of the ancient skalds, court poets of Norway and Iceland, who lived centuries before these words were written, who sang for kings and chieftains and wove into their verses the mythology of the gods their patrons worshipped. These poems echo from the 9th and 10th centuries forward. Their authority protected not by official religion, but by the sheer difficulty of memorizing verse. A poem, once mastered by a poet's ear and tongue, becomes nearly impossible to kill. It travels from mouth to mouth, preserved by the labor of memory. These poems, this old poetry, carried the myths of the gods into the medieval world, still alive, still transmitted, but growing more distant with each generation. But poetry is not explanation. Poetry is illusion, compression, imagery. A poet does not stop to tell you who these gods are, or what they represent, or why they matter. The poet assumes you already know. He assumes you have lived inside these stories your whole life, that their references are as natural to you as breathing. So as the medieval world unfolded, as Christianity replaced the old gods in the hearts of men, as the skaldic tradition began to fade, the myths began to break apart. The poems survived those ancient verses preserved in the Codex Regius, but their meaning grew opaque. A Christian reader could no longer parse the kennings. The old formulas seemed like fragments of a dead language. Knowledge was slipping away. Then came Snorri. He was born in the late 12th century. He was educated in an age when education meant knowledge of both the Christian and pagan traditions. He was politically powerful. He held land and power and the respect of other chieftains. He was a man of the church. And he had a problem. The old poetry was disappearing into incomprehension. The skalds were forgetting how to compose the elaborate metaphors and kennings that depended on knowing the myths. The tradition was being lost, so Snorri did what a 13th century educated man would do. He decided to systematize. He gathered the old poems. He wrote them down in prose. He explained them. He told the stories plainly so that other poets, future skalds, could learn the poetic language of their ancestors. He called it the Prose Edda, a manual for the craft of poetry, a handbook for the art of making verse. But Snorri was not simply transcribing, he was interpreting. And interpreting meant choosing a frame, a way of understanding these old alien stories so they would make sense to a Christian reader. The frame Snorri chose was this: the Norse gods were not gods at all, or at least not in any sense a Christian could accept. They had been gods only by accident, only in the eyes of a deluded people. In truth, they were ancient kings and warriors from the Near East, from Troy, from Thrace, who had migrated northward and were deified by the people they conquered. They were euhemerized into history, rationalized, reframed as figures of the distant human past, made rational through a Christian lens. What Snorri was writing was not a pagan theology. It was a 13th century Christian's explanation of why people had once believed in these things. His prose. Edda filtered the old myths through the eyes of a man who did not, could not, believe in them as divine. And yet, and here is where the two sources meet and become one stream of knowledge. The stories Snorri told were not invented. They come from the old poems. They come from the skaldic tradition. They come from a living past that Snorri, educated and Christian though he was, still honored enough to preserve. He did not throw them away. He held them up to the light and said, "These are not gods, but these are the stories our ancestors told, and because he did this, they survived." So we have a pantheon seen through a double lens. First lens, the court poets' selection. The gods who received the most elaborate praise, the richest poetry, the most intricate verses, were the gods whose cults mattered to kings and their listeners. Odin, god of poetry and wisdom and war. Thor, god of sovereignty and strength. These gods shine brilliantly through the skaldic corpus because powerful men valued them, because their stories were retold in the halls where poets lived, because kings' courts kept their names alive and rewarded the poets who sang of them. Several poems devoted to Thor survive: Thorstrapa, Haustlung, Ragnarstrapa, and Húsdrapa, evidence of how richly his story was elaborated in verse. Second lens, Snorri's choice. A 13th century Christian Icelandic politician deciding what was worth preserving, what was worth explaining, what was worth rendering into Latin letters and binding into a book. His frame was his choice. His interpretation was his alone. He chose which gods to elaborate on and which to leave sparse. He chose which stories to elaborate and which to compress. What does this double filtering mean? It means the pantheon you will meet is not a simple inventory. It is not a complete census of every god every Norse person ever called on. It is a survivors list. It is a record of the gods whose stories made it through the skaldic tradition, through the choice of scribes, through Snorri's hand, through medieval accident and preservation, and into the present day. Does this mean the pantheon is false? No. Does it mean it is incomplete? Almost certainly. What it means is this: the gods you will hear about are the gods who received narrative elaboration. They are the gods whose deeds were significant enough, or whose advocates were powerful enough, to get written into poems, and those poems copied, and those poems explained. They are the gods whose stories survived the journey from oral tradition through court poetry, through Christian manuscript, through ink and parchment into the present. But here is what the survivors list does not tell you. It does not tell you that the gods of the royal court were necessarily more important to ordinary people than other gods. It does not tell you that what was forgotten was unimportant, or that what was remembered was universal. It does not tell you that the most elaborated gods were the most widely worshipped gods. Take Thor. Archaeological evidence, hammer amulets dug from the earth, place names scattered across Scandinavia, the records of later observers like Adam of Bremen writing about temples, shows that real people worshipped him, called on him, shaped their lives and their piety around him. And in the skaldic poetry, Thor shines brilliantly. Entire poems were devoted to his deeds: Thorsdrapa, Haustlung, Ragnarsdrapa, Husdrapa. Poets competed to elaborate his stories and sing his praises. So Thor appears in both worlds, the court tradition and the evidence of real lived cult. For Thor, there is no gap between text and worship, no divergence between what was written and what was lived. But take another god, Ullr. His name is scattered across the Scandinavian map, in place names, in site names, in the marks of settlement and invocation. Real people called on Ullr. Ullr's cult was real and widespread, but of Ullr's story, his deeds, his saga, his place in the divine drama, almost nothing survives. A few lines, a reference to hunting, to skiing, to oaths, and then silence. The narrative is gone, even though the name persists everywhere in the land. The story was lost, even though the cult endured. The real mechanism, then, is not king's gods versus farmers' gods. The real mechanism is this: the gods with narrative and the gods without. The gods about whom stories were told elaborately enough to be written down and preserved. The gods who were only a name, potent, real to those who invoked them, deeply lived with, but stripped of story by the vicissitudes of what manuscripts survived and what hands chose to copy. This is the skeleton key to understanding the pantheon. A god's presence in the surviving texts is not a reliable measure of their importance to living people. What determined survival was whether a courtly or ecclesiastical performance and writing context preserved a narrative about them, whether storytellers deemed them worth elaborating, worth preserving in verse, worth transmitting to the future. And sometimes these two things, textual elaboration and lived cult, coincide perfectly. Sometimes they diverge entirely, and that is the frame for what follows. The pantheon you will meet exists because these stories were told. These stories were told because they mattered to people powerful enough that their poets kept them alive. And these poets' words were gathered, systematized, explained by Snorri Sturluson in the 1220s. Everything else, everything that was called on, invoked, lived with, worshipped, has become invisible to us because it never quite made the jump into narrative, never quite became a story worth preserving in ink and parchment. The gods of the Eddas are not the gods of the ancient Norse. They are the gods who survived being turned into a book. They are the gods whose stories a Christian Icelandic politician deemed worth saving. Understanding that difference, holding it clearly, is the skeleton key to everything that follows. Because every god you will meet not as they were worshipped, but as they were remembered, not as they lived in the hearts of real people, calling on them in desperate moments, but as their stories lived in verse and prose and the memory of poets. Not as whole figures with the full complexity of living cult, but as characters in a narrative that was gathered, filtered, interpreted, and bound into the work of one man's hands. The gods of the Eddas live inside the frame Snorri built. They speak with the voices he gave them. They are present only where his pen preserved them. And the moment he chose to write them down is the moment they were saved, and the moment, too, they were transformed. They became literature. They became Christian-era interpretation. They became the pantheon as seen through 13th century Icelandic eyes. Snorri Sturluson, holding a quill, deciding what the pantheon would be. That is where we begin. We know the shape of the world they described. Now we have to watch them build it out of a body. The creation of the world begins with ice and fire and void. Or more precisely, it begins with one question that no creation myth can quite answer. Where did the first thing come from? The Norse answer, the answer the Eddas give, starts not with creation ex nihilo, but with a name. Buri. Buri is the first, the primordial one. He was not made. He was not spoken into existence by some prior god. He simply was. The stories tell that he was licked free from ice by Audumbla, a primordial cow who herself emerged from the frozen void. The cow licked the ice, and the ice became a man. Buri, the first being. This is the moment before there is anything else, and yet Buri is already there. Not created, but discovered in the ice. Ontological bedrock, the first name, the first fact. From Buri came Bor. From Bor, the son of the first, came a wife. Her name was Bestla, daughter of the giant Bolthorn. And from the union of Bor and Bestla came 3 sons, Odin, Vili, Ve. These 3 brothers, sons of a being who emerged from ice, grandsons of a god licked into existence by a cosmic cow, nephews to the giants, would go on to reshape everything. They would become the architects of the cosmos. The first act of the 3 brothers was an act of violence. They looked at the existing world, the chaos, the endless void, the spaces between the realms, the primordial giant who occupied the center, and they saw a problem that required a solution. There was a giant named Ymir, primordial, ancient, occupying space, and the 3 brothers decided that Ymir should not exist, so they killed him. When Ymir died, the world was born. His flesh became the earth beneath the feet of gods and men. His blood became the seas and the lakes, the waters that now surround Midgard and fill it with fish and salt. His bones became the mountains, the hard spine of the world, the ranges that hold the sky up and divide the realms from each other. His teeth and fingernails became stone and gravel, the smaller rocks scattered across the land. His hair became the trees, the forests that would cover Midgard and shelter every creature. And his skull, the vault of his death. The 3 brothers took that great bone and held it aloft with 4 dwarfs, positioned at each corner, one at each cardinal direction, and it became the sky that now covers everything. This is the foundational sacrifice of the Norse cosmos. This is the murder that shapes the world. Ymir did not choose to die. There's no sense in which his death was voluntary or heroic or necessary to his own story. He was simply there, primordial, giant, occupying space, and the three sons of Bor decided he should not exist. And by killing him, they transformed chaos into order. They took a corpse and made a world from it. But the story does not end with the shaping of the earth and sea and sky. The gods had created the landscape. The bones and blood had become mountains and seas. The hair had become forests. Now they needed to populate Midgard. Now they needed to create beings who would live in this world they had shaped. Beings who would worship the gods who shaped it. And here is where the sources diverge, where the oldest surviving poem tells a different story than the prose systematization that came 3 centuries later. The poetic Edda, the old poems preserved in the Codex Regius, tells of 3 gods who walked among the newly formed world and found 2 pieces of wood lying on the shore or in the earth or in some liminal space between the realms. They named them Ask and Embla, man and woman, ash and elm, and these 3 gods gave them gifts. These 3 gods breathed into them something that transformed wood into being. The poetic Edda names these 3 gods, Odin, Hönir, and Hlín. But when Snorri Sturluson set down his prose account 3 centuries later, the names changed. The same 3-part act of creation, the same scene of gods giving gifts to the first humans, but different gods bestowing them. Snorri named Odin, Vili, and Ve. So here is the question that has to be asked aloud. Were the 3 gods who created humans the same 3 who slew Ymir? Or did the Norse tradition preserve 2 separate creation stories, with 2 different divine triads, and Snorri chose to reconcile them by substituting one set of names for another? Were Vili and Ve the brothers who murdered Ymir now again stepping forward to give humans life? Or were they names Snorri imposed on figures the old poems knew by other names? We cannot know for certain. The oldest poem, Völuspá, says Odin, Hönir, and Hlín. Snorri's prose says Odin, Vili, and Ve. Both are attested. Both are old. Both echo from deep tradition. But both cannot be literally true at the same time. So the question becomes not what really happened, but which tradition survived, and what did Snorri choose, and why? Let us follow Snorri's account, since it is the more elaborate and complete, and since it ties the creation of humanity to the slaying of Ymir through the same brotherhood, the same 3 actors moving through different scenes, shaping the cosmos at each step. In Snorri's telling, it was Odin, Vili, and Ve who gave Ask and Embla the gifts that made them human. Odin gave them spirit and life, breath, consciousness, the animating force that makes a piece of wood into a being aware of itself. Without Odin's gift, there is only matter. With it, there is awareness. There is knowing. There is the self recognizing itself. Vili gave them reason and the power of motion, the ability to think, to choose, to move through the world with intention and will, to understand cause and effect, to plan beyond the moment, to be an agent, not simply an object moved by external forces. Ve gave them form, speech, hearing, and eyesight, the capacity to perceive the world through the senses, to see light and color and the faces of others, to hear speech and music and the sounds of danger or joy, to speak themselves, to communicate, to make their own thoughts known to others, to have a body that is shaped and beautiful and capable. So in 3 gifts, the 3 brothers distributed what it means to be human. Body animated by spirit, mind capable of reason, senses open to the world. Each brother contributed one essential element. None could have done the whole work alone. All 3 were necessary. The gods then clothed Ask and Embla. They dressed them, made them complete, named them, spoke their names aloud, making them real, making their existence official and recognized. And they gave them Midgard to inhabit. They gave them a home, a world to live in. The realm that had been created from Ymir's body now had inhabitants. The cosmos was no longer empty. This is the first gift economy in the Norse cosmos. These are the first transactions between divine and mortal. The gods have now shaped not just the landscape, but the inhabitants of the landscape. They have made themselves necessary, because now there are beings who depend on them, who owe them gratitude, who will worship them and remember them and make offerings to them. But understand what this narrative is and what it is not. It is, as far as we know, Snorri's elaboration. The poetic Edda gives us the event, but not the specification. It does not tell us what gifts Henner gave or what exactly Laudur contributed. It does not make the gifts into a neat 3-part distribution of the aspects of humanity. It does not specify that one gave spirit, one gave reason, one gave the senses. Snorri systematized this. Snorri elaborated. Snorri took the old poem and made it rational, structured, complete, and beautiful in a way that a medieval Christian reader could understand and appreciate. Now in the new world, earth and sea and sky, and the first humans living in Midgard, 3 figures appeared, only to vanish. Vili and Ve, the brothers who helped shape the cosmos, are named by Snorri in the context of creation. They are the 2nd and 3rd sons of Bor and Bestla. They are co-slayers of Ymir. They are co-creators of the first humans. They are present at 2 of the most important moments in the cosmos. The moment the world was shaped and the moment humans were made. They are necessary, they are essential, and then they disappear. After the account of creation, after the gifts are given and Ask and Embla are clothed and named, Vili and Ve have no further narrative. They do not appear again in the sagas. They do not go on adventures. They do not fall in love or wage war or sacrifice their eyes or wander the cosmos. They do not speak. They do not take actions. They do not have deeds, no stories, no presence in the rest of the mythological record. They are structural figures, essential to the creation, absolutely necessary at the beginning, and then forgotten or displaced or absorbed into the gods who would dominate the rest of the cosmos. Odin, Thor, Frigg, the complex family drama of the Æsir, and the events that would lead to the wars of the gods. The same vanishing, even more complete, happens to Lodur. Lodur's erasure is almost total. In Völuspá, one of the oldest poems in the Codex Regius, believed to preserve material from the very early skaldic tradition, Lodur appears alongside Odin and Honir as one of the 3 creators. He is named. He is given a role. He gives Ask and Embla blood and good color. He is present in the creation, and then Lodur simply ceases to exist in the surviving record. Snorri does not list him among the gods. Later sources do not mention him. The later Christian scholars and collectors do not preserve his name or his story. All that remains is that single appearance in Völuspá, the single moment when his name was deemed important enough to write into verse. And that verse was deemed important enough to copy into a manuscript. This is what it means to be a minor figure in the Norse pantheon. You get one poem, one moment, one gift, and then silence. The texts that survive do not erase you. You are still there, preserved in carefully copied manuscripts, but your story does not continue. Your narrative does not elaborate. Your presence does not persist. The cosmos moves on without you, and you are left behind, known only to those who read the oldest poems carefully enough to spot your name. But here is a scholarly question that makes sense of the confusion and the overlap. What if Vili and Ve in Snorri's account are the same gods as Hönir and Lada, only wearing different names? What if the poetic Edda and the prose Edda are not describing two different creations with two different triads of gods, but rather recording the same creation story in two different traditions, where the names shifted over time or varied between regions? Scholars have proposed, and this is the dominant scholarly reading, though not unanimous, that Vili, who gives reason and motion in Snorri's version, corresponds to Hönir, who gives sense and intuition in the poetic Edda, and that Ve, who gives form and speech and sensation, corresponds to Lodr, who gives blood and good color. If these equations hold, if Vili is Hönir and Ve is Lodr, then there are not 4 forgotten gods, but 2. The same triad of creators called by different names in different sources, wearing the faces of Odin's brothers in the prose Edda, and the faceless names Odin, Hönir, and Lodr in the oldest verse. The same act of creation, preserved in 2 traditions, with the name shifted by centuries of transmission. But, and this is important, the Vili Hönir and Ve Lodr equation is the dominant scholarly interpretation. It is not unanimous. Some scholars have offered other identifications. Lodr has also been proposed as a byname for Loki by a minority scholarly view. What we are looking at is a reading, an interpretation laid over fragmentary sources by scholars working centuries later. It is the best reading available. It is not a fact that was sitting there all along, waiting to be found. What matters for this moment is this. In the beginning, there were 3 creators, 3 gods who shaped the world from the body of a dead giant. 3 gods who gave breath and reason and formed the first man and woman. In Snorri's account, these 3 are Odin, Vili, and Ve, brothers, sons of Bor and Bestla, instruments of a cosmos being born from chaos. And then 2 of them, or possibly the same gods under other names, step out of history and never appear again. They did their work at the beginning. They were essential. And then the rest of the saga, the rest of the divine drama that would consume the remaining pages of the Eddas, proceeds without them. The worlds multiply, the gods complicate, new figures arrive, wars break out, love stories tangle, futures are glimpsed, and Vili and Ve, or Hönir and Lodr, are simply gone. This too is part of what it means to survive as a Norse god. It means your name is recorded, your deeds are preserved, your importance is acknowledged, and it also means you can be forgotten anyway, faded into a single line or a single poem, present in the sources only to those who know to look for you, only to those who read carefully enough to ask why these names appear once and never again. Before we can count the gods, we have to meet the one who paid the most to learn how it all ends. Odin is not a god who received his power as a birthright. He is a god who paid for it, paid in flesh, paid in blood, paid in pieces of himself carved away like sacrifice to a hungrier god. And because everything he touches becomes a transaction, a deal, a price extracted in return for power, he is surrounded by symbols of debt, an empty eye socket, 2 birds whose wings beat with his secrets, a high throne that sees into all the worlds, and a hall full of warriors training for a war he already knows he will lose. To understand Odin, you must follow the chain of transactions. Each one is stranger and more costly than the last. Each one is attested not in vague mythic blur, but in the exact words of the poems. The poetic Edda speaks of it, and Snorri after. The oldest attested ordeal is also the most brutal. The poetic Edda records it in the poem called Havamal, the sayings of the High One, words spoken by Odin himself, confessing his own journey. It is a shamanic vision, not a battle, but an ordeal that is also an initiation, a self-inflicted wound that becomes the price of becoming something other than he was born. Odin climbed Yggdrasil, the world tree, the ash at the center of all existence, and hanged himself from its branches with a cord around his neck. Then he pierced his own body with his own spear, driving it through his side so that he hung there, wounded and bleeding. For 9 nights and 9 days he hung in that tree, the wind howling through him, the cold burning his skin, hunger eating at his belly, thirst cracking his throat, no bread to taste, no water to drink. Only the knowledge that if he could endure past the threshold where normal men die, something waited on the other side. On the 9th night, when his mind had been stripped down to almost nothing, vision broke through. He saw symbols, not letters, but deeper than language, the runes that order the fabric of reality itself, the runes that bind fate into patterns, the runes that magic draws and songs invoke. They revealed themselves to a god who had been willing to die for them. He seized them with a scream and fell back to earth, alive and transformed. This was not a gift. No other god gave this to him. Odin did this to himself, for himself. In a cosmos where gods are born to their nature, Odin rewrote his own nature through ordeal. He became a shaman god, marked by the willingness to dissolve the boundary between life and death, between knowing and unknowing, and come back the other side as something new. But the runes bought him only part of what he needed. They gave him power over magic and poetry and hidden knowledge, yes, but there is a knowledge deeper still, the knowledge of fate itself, of what is to come, of the moment of his own death, of the end of all things. To acquire that knowledge, he had to approach the source. There is a well at the root of Yggdrasil called Mímir's Well, and it is guarded by a being named Mímir, a figure of such ancient wisdom that he knows all that was, all that is, and all that will be. The water of that well holds foreknowledge in solution, but to drink from it is not free. To drink from that well and gain the power of prophecy, Odin offered his eye. Not a token, not a symbol, his actual eye. He left it sunken in the water at the well's bottom, a physical tether between himself and the knowledge he had bought. He walks now as the one-eyed god, always marked by the price of knowing, always reminded by the half-blindness that truth is never free. The runes and the eye bought him knowledge, but knowledge alone is not power if you cannot access it. So Odin engineered himself instruments of omniscience. The poetic Edda describes them. He has 2 ravens, whose names are Hugin and Munin, thought and memory. Each morning they launch themselves from his shoulders and fly out into all 9 worlds. They see everything, the feasts of gods, the battles of men, the deaths and births, the marriages and murders, the words whispered in secret, and the oaths sworn at altars. Each evening they return to Odin's shoulders and perch there, whispering all that they have witnessed into his ear. Through these birds, Odin hears the world, but hearing alone is not enough. He also sits in a high seat called Hlidskjalf, a throne so elevated that from it he can see into every corner of all 9 worlds at once. The runes let him read the hidden. The ravens bring him news. The high seat gives him sight. 3 layers of surveillance, each paid for with some piece of himself. Yet a god who knows everything is a god who sees his own death coming. So Odin did not build himself 1 refuge, but 2. 2 halls that serve 2 utterly different purposes. The first is called Valaskjalf. The gods roofed this dwelling with silver and raised its walls, a hall of sovereignty and surveillance. Inside it stands the high seat Hlidskjalf, where Odin sits watching all the worlds. This is Odin's oracle, his lookout post, his war room. From here he sees Ragnarok approaching like a storm across all 9 worlds. From here he watches the ash tree shudder and knows that it has begun. This is not a place of rest, but a place of relentless attention, a throne built for witnessing. But there is another hall, a second instrument entirely. It is Valhalla, the hall of the slain. This is not a reward or a paradise, though modern stories have made it so. The Eddas make clear what it actually is: a war army in training. Inside Valhalla, warriors chosen by the Valkyries, handpicked by fate, are brought to Odin's hall to become his conscripted soldiers. Each morning they train, fighting each other in single combat. Each evening their wounds close, and they feast together. They are the Einherjar, the chosen dead, locked in an eternal cycle of preparation for a war Odin already knows is coming. He sees it in the runes. His ravens bring him news of it. His high seat lets him watch it approach hour by hour. And so he has built Valhalla not as paradise, but as barracks, a forge of warriors, because he will need every single fighter when the end comes. The god who sacrificed everything to know the future has spent that knowledge building an army for a battle he cannot win. This is the god preparing for his own defeat, systematically gathering an army he knows will lose. The poetic Edda gives Odin so many names that it becomes impossible to contain him in a single word or concept. He is called the All-Father, for he is the father of all the Aesir. He is the god of spears. He is the god of hanged men, Hangatir, for those executed men who were sacrificed to him by rope. He is the one-eyed. He is the wanderer, moving disguised through all the worlds, gathering secrets. He is the bringer of victory to armies, the father of battle. Each name is a different face, a different transaction, a different debt. Each one speaks to a different moment when Odin made a deal, or claimed a domain, or took something and gave something in return. He is not a unified personality, but a nexus of functions, held together by sheer will and centuries of cunning deals. And then there is the question that breaks even him. The poetic Edda contains a poem called Vafthrudnismal, the Song of Vafthrudnir, which records a wisdom contest between Odin and a giant of such age and terrible knowledge that the giant's very name, Vafthrudnir, means powerful in riddles. Through an entire night they exchange riddles and answers, testing the limits of each other's knowledge of the 9 worlds and the cosmos itself. The giant has answers for everything. But at the very end, when all the riddles seem exhausted, Odin asks one final question. He asks the giant, What did Odin himself whisper in the ear of his son Balder before Balder was placed on the funeral pyre? The giant cannot answer. No one in all the 9 worlds can answer except Odin himself. And by asking a question that only he can answer, Odin proves his identity and wins the contest, proving that even in his age of runes and ravens and omniscience, he still holds one secret that the cosmos will not reveal. But here is the crucial thing. The poem never tells us what was said. It is the single gap the Norse tradition built into itself deliberately, a secret that will never be filled, not because the knowledge was lost to time, but because the sources themselves refused to write it down. What Odin told his dying son is a transaction between them alone that the universe will not witness. Even Snorri, the Christian politician in the 13th century who wrote down nearly everything we know, left this one space empty. A god of transaction from the moment he hung himself for runes to the moment he will die, knowing exactly when and how it comes. That is Odin, a god who understood that power requires payment, a god who paid with his eye, with his time, with his identity fragmented into dozens of names, with his mortality, and in the end, even with his silence. Everyone can name the All-Father. Almost nobody can name the 14 women who stood in his hall. And that gap is not an accident. Frigg sits first among all the goddesses. She is the wife of Odin and the mother of the gods. She dwells in a hall called Fenrir, a name that means the misty marshes, or the halls hidden in fog. And like her husband, Frigg knows what is to come. She knows the fate of all beings. But unlike Odin, who built ravens and high seats to broadcast what he knows, Frigg keeps her knowledge to herself. She knows, but does not speak. The prose Edda tells us that she is attended by a goddess named Fulla, who carries her casket of secrets and knows them, and Fulla carries her keys as well. Frigg's knowledge is held in chambers that only Fulla may unlock. After Frigg, the record grows thin. Snorri Sturluson, the Christian politician who wrote down most of what we know, lists 14 primary goddesses in his prose Edda. They are Frigg herself, Sága, Gefjun, Fulla, Freyja, Sjöfn, Lofn, Vor, Sin, Hlín, Snotra and Gná. He also lists others: Sol, the sun goddess, Bil, the Valkyries by name, Njörðr, the earth goddess, and Rind, as numbered among the goddesses. But here is the problem that scholarship has long grappled with. Most of these figures have no surviving myths. They have no stories. Many of them do not appear anywhere in the poetic Edda, the older and more archaic layer of Norse myth. They appear only in Snorri's catalogue, described in 1 or 2 sentences each. And so there is a question that hangs over the entire list. Did Snorri inherit this roster whole from ancient times? Or did he, a 13th century Icelandic intellectual, systematize and perhaps even invent parts of it to make his account of the gods more balanced and complete? That question has no settled answer, and it will follow us through every hall we enter. But Snorri is almost all we have. Some goddesses appear in more than one place. Fulla, for instance, is named not only by Snorri, but also in a 10th century Old High German healing charm called the Merseburg charm. In that ancient text, a goddess named Volla, linguistically identical to Fulla, appears, and she is called not a handmaid, but the sister of Frigg's continental counterpart, Freyja. So Fulla is genuinely ancient, attested across the Germanic world and over centuries. But the 2 sources agree on only one thing: her name. Everything else is contradiction. Is she Frigg's servant or her sister? Is she hand in hand with Frigg or standing on equal ground? The sources do not say the same thing, and both are old. Sága, the second goddess in Snorri's list, appears in both his prose and in the poetic Edda itself. In the poetic Edda, the poem Grimnismal names Sjöfn as one of the god's great halls, a place where cool waves resound and Odin and Sága drink daily from golden cups in joy. Here is Sága, not a name, not an abstraction, but a figure in a scene, a daily ritual of drinking with the king of the gods. Snorri repeats it. She dwells at Sjöfn and drinks with Odin. But who is Sága, really? What is her function? The sources do not say beyond that single image, a goddess drinking wine with Odin, while water sounds play around them. Some scholars have suggested that Sága might not be a separate goddess at all, but another name for Frigg herself, that both their halls are watery and hidden, that the two names might belong to the same being. The question is still open. It is worth holding open rather than closing by force. Eir is named by Snorri as the third goddess and called the best of physicians. But she is not only in Snorri, she also appears in a poem called Fjölsvinnsmal, where she sits among the maiden attendants of a mysterious lady called Menglöd on a hill named Lífjaberg, the Hill of Healing. The fact that Eir appears in two completely separate sources doing the same thing, healing, suggests that this goddess's function was real and remembered. But scholarship debates whether the Eir in Fjölsvinnsmal is the same figure as Snorri's physician goddess, or a different local figure who happened to share a name. And who is Menglöd? Some say she is a form of Frigg, some say Freyja. The sources have left us with a cluster of names and functions, but no certainty. Then there are the goddesses who appear only in Snorri, with no other attestation anywhere. Var is one such figure. Snorri says she is the goddess who hears all oaths and vows plighted between men and women. So much so that such vows are called Varar, named after her. She punishes those who break their sworn word. But Snorri is not her only surviving attestation. She also appears in the Eddic poem Þrymskvida, in the scene where the giant Thrymr demands Mjölnir be laid in Thor's lap to consecrate a false wedding. The giant cries out that he demands the couple be hallowed together by Var's hand, invoking the oath goddess to sanctify what he does not know is a trap. So Var appears in an actual scene of poetry, in an act of savage irony. The very goddess of binding oaths is called upon to consecrate a wedding vow that is a lie. Ver, a different goddess, spelled differently, is described by Snorri as wise and searching in spirit, such that nothing can be concealed from her. She has no myth, no scene, no other source. She is a single line in Snorri defining her as the personification of perceptiveness, and then she vanishes. Snotra is prudent and of gentle bearing, and Snorri notes that things done wisely by men and women are named after her. Her entire corpus is a single abstracted virtue. Her name itself is built from the Old Norse word for wise or clever, and she may never have been more than a personified quality rather than a figure with any actual cult or narrative. Sjöfn is most diligent in turning the thoughts and minds of men and women toward love. That is all. No scene, no context, no other source. Lofn is so gracious and gentle in hearing petitioners that she can win Odin's or Frigg's leave for marriages, even when such unions have been forbidden or refused. Her one function is to override the pantheon's own marriage restrictions, a built-in mechanism of divine mercy inside a legal system otherwise capable of saying no. But no myth shows her doing this. No poem describes her at work. Yet here is where these thin goddesses begin to cohere into something meaningful. Read these four together: Sjöfn, Lofn, Var, and Vör, and they form a sequence that maps exactly onto the real legal stages of Old Norse marriage. Sjöfn turns two people's minds toward love, the onset of desire. Lofn secures permission for the union, even against prior refusal, the securing of consent from the authorities. Var hears the spoken oath between them and holds it sacred, the binding vow. Vör's searching wisdom ensures that nothing false in the marriage can stay hidden, the truth testing. This is not random. Scholarship on Old Norse marriage procedure recognizes this sequence. 4 one-line goddesses, each describing one stage of a real legal process that would have governed marriages in a Norse household, that couples would have undergone and named and understood. Snorri may not have invented these 4. He may have systematized a genuine piece of how the Norse people understood marriage as a sacred and legally bound act. There is also Gná, the messenger of Frigg, who rides a horse called Hofvapnir, a name meaning hoof-thrower, a horse sired by Hamskapir out of Gardrofa, who gallops over both sky and sea. Gná is unique among the goddesses in Snorri's list because she is given not just an epithet, but actual words. When some Vanir saw her riding through the air, she answered them in verse, giving her horse's parentage. Gná is the only goddess in the catalogue who gets to speak, a thin fragment of dialogue, but a fragment nonetheless. It makes her, thin as she is, feel more like a scene than a stat block. But most of the other goddesses are not so lucky. Hlín, according to Snorri, is the goddess appointed to guard whomever Frigg wishes kept from danger. But the poetic Edda, in its prophecy of Ragnarok called Völuspá, names Hlín's second sorrow for the moment when Odin goes to fight the wolf at the end of all things. And most translators read this as Frigg's own grief, using Hlín as a poetic name for Frigg herself. Hlín is appointed to protect those Frigg loves. But on the day that matters most, when Odin dies at Ragnarok, that protection fails completely. Frigg's first sorrow was Baldr's death. Her second sorrow is Odin's, and no guardian goddess can save him. So Hlín raises a question that opens up the entire roster. Is Hlín a separate goddess, or is she simply Frigg wearing another name, visible only when certain conditions make her function necessary? How many times in this list are we counting the same being twice, scattered into different names? How many times has the tradition fragmented a single goddess into multiple faces? And how many times did Snorri inherit genuine distinctions between figures? There is a moment when this uncertainty crystallizes into a methodological crisis. Snorri lists 16 Asynjur, but roughly half of them, Sjöfn, Lofn, Var, Vör, Sin, Hlín, Snotra, and Gná, have no attestation anywhere in the Skaldic verse or the Eddic poems independent of this one passage in Snorri's Gylfaginning. They do not appear in any poem. They are not invoked in any narrative. They surface only in Snorri's catalogue. And so the scholarship on Snorri's method becomes relevant. Snorri was not a mere copyist of ancient texts. He was a systematizer. He had a corpus of older material, poems, stories, traditions, and he shaped them into a coherent, comprehensive account. The fact that half his goddesses are unattested elsewhere suggests that he may have supplemented a shorter inherited list of female divine figures to build a symmetrical female counterpart to his catalogue of male Æsir. to make the books balance, to create a pantheon as complete as his male-focused sources allowed. This is not a scandal. It is how encyclopedias are made. It is what happens when a medieval Christian compiler tries to preserve a pagan tradition that is already fragmentary. But it means this. The roster of the Asynjur, the Hall of the Goddesses, is not a census of the goddesses as the Norse believed in them. It is a survivors list, shaped and completed by one man's judgment about what belonged and what did not. And we are left with names, with functions, with a few scenes, with a few conflicts between sources, with a great deal of silence. One of those goddesses did something no god of the North ever managed. She took land, and she kept it. There is a goddess who should not have survived at all. She frames the entire prose Edda. Her act is the story that opens the book. The reason King Gylfi puts on his disguise and travels to Asgard in the first place. The narrative hinge on which the whole text turns. And yet she is barely remembered at all. Her name is Gefjun, and she is the clearest possible proof of everything this episode claims. That the survivors list is not a census, that proximity to power does not earn a story, that a goddess can be load-bearing enough to structure an entire sacred text and still vanish into almost nothing. Before King Gylfi arrives in Asgard to seek the gods' wisdom, the prose Edda opens with a prologue. It is a story of geography, not theology. It is a story of a goddess and a ploughing. Gefjun, the text tells us, had sons once. Or rather, she did not have sons anymore. She transformed 4 sons she had borne by a giant into oxen, massive creatures of divine strength, creatures bound to labor. She harnessed them to a plow. And then she put her hands to that plow, together with her oxen, and cut a great furrow through the land of Sweden. The ploughing was not a minor act of rearrangement. It was a continental surgery. She pulled such a vast tract of earth free that she dragged it into the sea itself, and it became an island. That island is Zealand. The hole left behind in Sweden became a lake, and this act of unmade geography is the story the prose Edda chose to begin with. The image is concrete and terrible. A goddess yielding a plow like a farmer in the fields, except her plow is drawn by oxen that were once her own children. 4 sons transformed into beasts of burden. What is the story of that transformation? What did they cost? What did Gefjun lose in the moment she made them into instruments of labor? The sources do not say. The sources only say it happened, that she did it, that the ploughing followed. The sons turned oxen are mentioned and never again discussed. They sink into silence. And the ploughing itself, a woman in the field, the earth turning under the blade, the land separating from the earth it has been part of since the world's making, the vast island sliding into the sea and settling there, taking its new form, becoming Zealand. An act of such magnitude that it reshapes the very geography of the world. An act of such power that it requires a goddess to accomplish it. And then it is done. Here is the strangest thing about Gefjun. She is the frame of the entire book, and then she vanishes. King Gylfi travels to Asgard because he wants to understand this ploughing. Why the goddess did it, how it was possible, what it means. The whole dialogue that follows, the entire Gylfaginning, exists because Gefjun's act sent him seeking. She is the reason the book happens at all. She is the narrative gateway. She is the essential. And then, from the moment that ploughing is told, Gefjun has almost no independent story. She is barely developed as a character, barely present in any of the dialogue about the gods and their deeds, barely anything at all. She is the frame, and the frame is invisible once you pass through it. The story that justifies the entire text is followed by a story in which the goddess, who made that story necessary, is almost entirely forgotten. This is what the survivors list, not a census, means. Gefjun did not disappear because she was insignificant. She survived because she did something that mattered. She reshaped the earth. She provided a place name to anchor a kingdom. She gave Snorri something to explain to his Christian audience about why this island exists. But she survived into the tradition as only the barest minimum necessary to do that job. A goddess, load-bearing enough to structure the entire sacred text, handed down to us with almost no independent story of her own. But the story does not end there. It multiplies. Decades after he wrote Gylfaginning's prologue, the same author, Snorri Sturluson, the same man, sat down and wrote the Ynglinga Saga, the dynasty history of the Swedish kings. This is a different kind of text. It is not pure myth, not pure history, but something in between, an euhemerist account, a translation of the divine into the genealogical. And there, in the same landscape, at the same historical moment, appears the same Gefjun. Except now she is not a goddess, she is a woman. In Ynglinga Saga, Gefjun is a woman in Odin's retinue, a figure of the semi-historical world, a mortal woman with agency and choice, and a role in a narrative of power. She is rewarded with the plowed land, the same island that mythology said she tore free with her plow. But in this register, the plowing becomes a grant, not a divine act, a reward for some service or achievement. Then she marries Njörðr, not a giant, not a divine figure, but Njörðr, who is described as a son of Odin, a human king, the founder of the royal line of Leisure. The same story, the same island, the same act of plowing, told twice, in two registers, by the same author, in the same work. Myth becomes genealogy. The goddess becomes a woman. The divine plowing becomes a grant of land within a narrative of kingdoms and succession. The entire Edda's opening scene, the moment that sent Gylfi journeying, is quietly recast as a founding event of a human royal house, an episode in the long chain of mortal kings. The sacred is demoted to the historical, the magic to the probable, the divine act to a reward and a marriage. This is euhemerism in action, not in the crude hands of later Christian interpreters who read the sagas centuries later and genuinely believed they were discovering history, not in the clumsy work of outside commentators. In Snorri's own hands, turning myth into genealogy, divine act into dynastic precedent, a goddess into a woman, in the same breath, in the same text, with full awareness of what he was doing. The same episode, the same author, caught in the act of demoting the sacred to the historical. The filter itself has been caught, exposed, displayed in a single work, so we can see both sides of it. There is one other line about Gefjun in the entire corpus of surviving Norse sources. In the goddess catalogue in Gylfaginning, Snorri describes her as a virgin, a woman who has never known a man. And he says that all women who die unmarried, all women who never bear children, become her attendants after death. They serve her in the world beyond. It is a single sentence. It disconnects entirely from the ploughing story that opens the whole book. The two versions of Gefjun, the frame narrative heroine and the one-line catalogue entry, never touch in the text itself, never meet, never acknowledge each other. Gefjun is a virgin who bears sons. Gefjun is a goddess who tore a continent in half. Gefjun is a woman who married and founded a kingdom. Gefjun is a name in a list. These faces of her never cohere. They scatter across different registers, different texts, different moments in Snorri's own authorship. Yet she remained in the tradition, all of her, despite her fragmentation, because the ploughing was useful. Because an origin story for Zealand was something a Christian Icelandic politician needed to explain to his medieval audience. Because she provided a narrative hook, a place name, a genealogy. But the story of Gefjun herself, the goddess who transformed her own sons into instruments of labor, who moved continents with her hands, who was powerful enough that her act required an entire king to journey to the gods in search of understanding. That complete story the tradition did not preserve. That story was expendable. What remained was the minimum, the function without the biography, the gateway without the gatekeeper. She plowed an island out of the sea. She was demoted to a genealogy by her own chronicler. She was collapsed to a one-line sentence in a catalogue. She lived, she survived, but she survived as almost nothing at all. This is what the survivors list means. This is the filter, caught in the act, working before our eyes. The strongest of them all lived here too, not as a hero, but as a husband, a father, and a man with a stone lodged in his skull. Thor was the most historically worshipped god in the Norse pantheon. More farms bore his name than Odin's. More amulets in the shape of his hammer were buried in graves across Scandinavia than any symbol of any other deity. More warriors called on his name in the moments before battle than called on any god. He was powerful, famous, the god of thunder and strength, the god of the sky who stood at Midgard's edge and held back the giants with his hammer, the god who was supposed to fight the forces of chaos and disorder and keep the cosmos from collapsing. He was the defender, the protector, the warrior god. And yet he was also the most domestic god in the entire pantheon. And it is in his household, not in his combats, but in his house, that we see how this society actually held together, how gods and giants and servants and family were bound to one another by debt, by compensation, by violation and restitution. He was married to Sif. Her name means relation, a word for kinship itself, a word that names the bond between family members. She was golden-haired. This much everyone knew. This much the tradition emphasized. But the hair was not hers by nature. In the beginning, there was mischief. Loki, for reasons that are never explained, and perhaps no reason at all, cut off Sif's hair while she slept beside her husband. It was an act of violation. A sleeping woman, unable to defend herself, robbed of her hair by a god's malice. The hair that made her golden, that identified her, that was part of her beauty and herself. When Thor discovered what had happened, he was enraged. He did not negotiate with Loki. He did not ask questions. He forced the trickster to make restitution, forced him to go to the dwarves, to commission new hair from the finest craftsmen in all the worlds. The sons of Ivaldi, the greatest dwarfsmiths, took up the work. They worked bronze and fire and gold. They forged what was lost. They made Sif a new head of hair, woven from pure gold, so carefully crafted that it would grow like living hair once it was set upon her head. The hair would flow, it would move, it would be hers. But Loki, constrained to make restitution, did not stop at a single commission. He stood in the smithy and agreed to bargain with the dwarves again and again. The sons of Ivaldi, in the same breath, in the same forge work, created new treasures. They forged Odin's spear, Gungnir, the weapon that never misses, that always finds its target, that is the symbol of the All-Father's will. They forged Freyr's ship Skidbladnir, built so cunningly from the combined efforts of the greatest dwarf minds that it could hold an entire army in its hull, yet fold small enough to fit in a pouch when it was not needed. 3 treasures, 3 commissions, all of it flowing from the same moment. A husband's rage at his wife's violation, the force of Thor compelling restitution, the dwarves' answer. This is Sif's only story. This is the sole narrative in the entire corpus of surviving sources in which she appears as a central figure. She is Thor's wife twice over, once by the fact of their marriage, once as the victim whose violation launches the whole sequence of events that remakes the war equipment of the gods. The dwarf treasures that will reshape the conflict between Æsir and giants all flow from Loki's blow to her head. Yet she has no agency in her own narrative. None. It happens while she sleeps. She never wakes in the story. She never speaks. She never asks for anything. She is the occasion for every other god's gift. Odin receives the spear, Freyja receives the ship. Thor receives both golden hair for his wife and the leverage to force the dwarves into further commissions. But she is never the actor in her own scene. She is the object upon which events happen. The wife of the most historically worshipped god in the pantheon is one of the least developed named wives in all the surviving sources. She has no independent cult attested anywhere. She has no additional myth, no story that is hers alone. She has no voice anywhere in the corpus. She never speaks a line of dialogue, never makes a choice, never acts. She is mentioned in the genealogy. She is mentioned in one story, and then she is gone. Thor had children. With Sif, he had 2 sons, Magni and Modi. Their names are not histories. They are not names earned through deeds or stories. Magni means might, a word that names power itself. Modi means anger, pure affect, emotion without narrative. They are named for what they represent, not for what they do. With Sif, he also had a daughter named Thrudr. Strength, whose name mirrors the name of Thor's own hall and realm, Thrudvangar, the place called Strength Fields. Her entire attestation is a genealogy and a place name. That is all. She has no independent action anywhere in the sources, no story that belongs to her alone, no myth in which she is the actor. She is present in the world's structure. Her name is literally inscribed on the map, written into the geography of the divine realm, but she is absent from every narrative. She is a name and an echo of her father's power, nothing more. But Thor also had children with others. The giantess Jansaksa bore him sons too. Thor's household was not closed, not isolated, not pure. A god of thunder bound to the most worshipped mortal cult in all of Scandinavia was also entangled with the Jotun world, with giants, with the very beings his thunder was supposed to oppose. Giants were enemies of the gods, or so the theology said. But Thor's household admitted giants. His bed admitted giants. His children carried giant blood. Magni and Modi were sons with Sif. But there was another son, older, born of the giantess Jansaksa. His birth was an origin story in its own right, a foreshadowing of the strength that would matter after the end of the world. His introduction into the mythology is not a genealogy. It is an act of birth strength that exceeds even the power of the assembled Æsir. 3 days. Magni was 3 days old. On the 3rd day after his birth, Thor stood in duel against the stone-headed giant Hrungnir. It was not a minor combat. Hrungnir was massive, a giant of stone and bone, wielding a whetstone as a weapon. In the fight, one of Hrungnir's whetstone fragments flew loose and struck Thor in the skull. It did not glance off. It lodged. It stayed. The stone fragment became a permanent wound, a scar in the body of the god himself. It could never be removed. It would stay in his skull for the rest of his life. Thor would carry it until Ragnarok, until the end of everything, a permanent marking, a permanent debt owed to the giant. Hrungnir fell. His body was massive, crushing, a weight of stone and flesh. When he collapsed, one of his massive legs fell across Thor's body, pinning him to the ground. The god could not move. He was trapped beneath the weight of his enemy. The Æsir gathered around. They brought their strength to bear. They tried to move the stone leg. None of them, not Odin with all his wisdom, not the assembled council of the Æsir in their full power, could shift it. The god of thunder lay pinned under the dead giant, unable to rise, unable to free himself. They worked and strained and could not move him. Then Magni arrived. Magni, 3 days old. Magni still an infant, small as an infant should be, small as no god should be capable of moving mountains. And the infant's hands grasped the stone leg that had pinned the most powerful god in Asgard, and Magni lifted it. He freed his father from the weight. He did what the whole company of gods could not accomplish. Thor lay bloodied on the ground, with a stone fragment in his skull. He had achieved victory over Hrungnir, but at a cost he would carry forever. And the infant who had saved him from the weight of the giant, the infant who was only 3 days old, had proven himself capable of feats that exceeded the strength of gods. Thor took the only gift that had come to him from the fight, the only payment for victory, and gave it to his newborn son, Hrungnir's horse, a reward for a deed accomplished in the first hours of life. When Ragnarok comes, when the rainbow breaks and the giants advance, when the whole world is consumed by fire and flood and the collapse of order itself, when Thor falls in his final battle with the Midgard serpent, it will be Magni and Modi who inherit Mjolnir, the hammer that holds back the chaos. They will be the ones trusted with the weapon after their father is gone. And this is their introduction to the mythology, an impossibly strong newborn, capable of feats the gods cannot manage, a son who proves he is worthy of what will be given to him. But Thor was also a man of compensation and debt. He held a household bound not by blood alone, but by the ties of obligation that ran deeper than family. When Loki had been forced to commission the dwarves to replace Sif's hair, the bargaining and wagering had spiraled outward. The dwarves demanded a wager on whether they could make treasures finer than the sons of Ivaldi's work. Loki wagered his own head on the outcome, confident in his luck. He lost. The dwarves won. They demanded payment. But Thor, in his capacity as a god of debt law, would not allow Loki to be beheaded. Instead, he demanded restitution in a different form. He demanded that Loki find substitutes, 2 human beings, taken as compensation, bound to Thor's household. Not slaves in the crude sense, but debtors. People whose service was the price of a violation, whose obligation was written into the very fabric of the household itself. Thjalfi and Röskva were their names. Brother and sister, both young, both taken from their ordinary lives. Thjalfi was the fleetest of foot among all men. When he ran, nothing could catch him. No other being in any of the 9 worlds could outpace him. But his fleetness could not save him from the web of debt. He had broken the thigh bone of one of Thor's goats, an accident while searching for marrow inside the bone, seeking the vital core of the animal and finding only the hollow space, leaving behind a fracture. It was a small violation. It cascaded into servitude. This is how Thor's household worked, a chain of violation and compensation flowing backward and forward through relationships, each one anchored to a debt, each debt anchored to an act. Loki's mischief led to Thor's rage, which led to dwarves' commission, which led to wagering, which led to Loki's defeat, which led to the demand for substitutes, which led to Thjalfi and Röskva's bondage. And Thjalfi's accident with the goat's bone simply revealed a debt that was already there, waiting to be called in. Violence and magic and accidents all fed into the same system of obligation. And the goats themselves were not ordinary animals. They were not livestock in the common sense. Thor possessed 2 of them, Tungjostr and Tungrisnir, and their names mean snarl and grinder, words that name aggression, that name hunger itself. These 2 goats drew Thor's chariot across the sky, pulling the god of thunder from realm to realm, their power carrying him through the air. They were the engine of his mobility, the means by which he could move across the cosmos. At night, when the chariot stopped and the journey ended, Thor could kill them. He could slaughter them for food, a meal provided by his own property, sustenance drawn from the very creatures that carried him. But the goats were bound to him by magic, not by nature or contract. They were renewal itself. In Snorri's telling, if the bones were laid unbroken on their hides, if the ritual was performed with precision, if the magic was not interrupted, Thor could resurrect them the next morning with Mjolnir. The hammer that had killed them could restore them. They were a renewable food supply. They were his to consume and his to restore. They were bound to him by the same power that would eventually fail at Ragnarök, when the hammer would fall from his hands and even resurrection would become impossible. This is the household of the most historically worshipped god in the Norse pantheon, not the dwelling of a cosmic warrior or a hero of legend. A household bound by domestic relationships, by violation and compensation, by the constant flow of debt and restitution. A wife whose only story is a victimization. Children whose names are place markers and power states, not deeds or stories. Servants bound by the chain of accident and obligation. A giantess as a partner. An infant son who exceeded the strength of gods. 2 goats that could be killed and restored in an endless cycle, and the god himself bearing a permanent wound. A stone fragment lodged in his skull from a duel, a scar that marks his body as long as he lives, a reminder of every giant he has fought and every cost he has paid. This is Thor, not as a hero or a champion, not as the mighty warrior standing alone against the forces of chaos. This is Thor as a member of a society, embedded in relationships of debt and compensation, marked by his own conflicts, bound to those who serve him, entangled with giants through his bed and his children. The god of thunder was also a man in a house with a wife, children, servants, partners, and a body that carried the marks of every fight it had survived. Every wound was a story, every relationship was a debt, and every debt was a thread holding the whole household together. So far, the two families have stood side by side. They did not begin that way. They began at war. But before this pantheon of Æsir became the full society the Eddas describe, it did not hold the Vanir, and that meant war. The first warfare in the cosmos came from a single act of violence. A figure entered Asgard, or arrived into its awareness, whom the sources name Gullveig. The name means gold thirst. The Æsir did not welcome her. They took a spear, and they ran it through her. Then they took her to the hall of Odin, and they burned her there, in that high place, watching her die. But when the flames released her, when the fire had spent itself on her body, she rose again, not scarred, not diminished, unburnt. And then they burned her again. A second time the fire consumed, and a second time she emerged. A third time, still seeking the knowledge or the transformation that burning might grant. Each time she returned whole, and each time she carried something new, a knowledge perhaps, or a name. After the third burning, this figure took a different form or shed a different skin. She became known as Haida, meaning bright, and she walked into the world as something new, a prophetess, a seer, a witch who traveled among the peoples teaching the dark craft. The burning of Gullveig was not an isolated incident of divine cruelty. It was a provocation, and it unleashed the first war the 9 worlds had ever seen. The Vanir came in answer to that burning. The two divine families, the Æsir, whom we know from the center of the myths, and the Vanir, whom the sources treat as powerful and foreign, met in open warfare. Both sides ravaged the other with ferocity. They broke the walls of each other's halls. They hammered with weapons. They rode against one another with the will of gods, determined to annihilate. And they went on and on, until the land itself bore the scars of their conflict, until the very foundation of the cosmos seemed to shudder under their weight. But neither side could break the other. And so, war-worn and exhausted, equally matched and equally unable to achieve victory, the Æsir and the Vanir came at last to understand that the only way forward was not triumph. It was survival. They agreed to halt. They agreed to make peace. To seal that peace, to make it real and binding in a way that mere oath could not, they performed a ritual that bound the two families at the deepest level. Both sides gathered. They spat, all of them, every god from every realm, and the saliva of the Æsir mingled with the saliva of the Vanir in a great jar. And from that mingling, from the literal union of the two divine bloodlines, they shaped a man. They named him Kvasir. Kvasir was not born, he was made. He was the embodiment of peace itself, the literal distillation of the accord that the Æsir and Vanir had reached. And he was so wise that no one in all the 9 worlds could ask him a question he could not answer. Every mystery laid before him found its resolution. Every riddle bent to his understanding. The Æsir and Vanir looked at him and saw what their conflict had purchased. A being whose wisdom was so perfect, so complete, that he could walk among all the worlds, and no question would exhaust him. But Kvasir's wisdom would not survive the peace that created him. Before that doom arrived, before the dwarves Fjalar and Galar murdered him for the sake of his blood, the pantheon had to bind itself together with more than treaty, more than the memory of exhaustion. They had to bind themselves with hostage and kinship. The Vanir sent their own to live among the Æsir. They sent Njörðr, a god of wealth and wind and the sea. They sent Freyja, Njörðr's son, whom the future would name the most renowned of all gods. They sent Freyja, These were not the Æsir, but they would live as if they were. They would dwell in Asgard, would take up the patterns of the high gods, would intermarry and ally until the line between Vanir and Æsir grew too tangled to read clearly, and the Æsir sent their own into Vanaheim, into the realm of the Vanir, to walk their halls as surety. They sent Hönir, a god of choice and speech, or so the sources suggest, and they sent Mímir. Mímir arrived as the wisest of all beings. Beneath the frost giant root of Yggdrasil stood a well, the well of all wisdom, the spring from which foreknowledge flowed. Mímir was its guardian. He knew the past because the well held all its echoes. He knew the future because the well's waters showed him the shape of things to come. And when Odin himself, the father of the gods, had sacrificed an eye, torn it from its socket, let it fall into the depths. He had drunk the price of foreknowledge from Mimir's own hand. Mimir's reputation was vast. His wisdom was legend. And yet in the halls of the Vanir, even Mimir's power proved insufficient. Hönir was a speaker. He was the god of the deliberation, of the moment when speech decides fate. But in the councils of the Vanir, Hönir would not speak unless Mímir was at his side. Every time the Vanir brought a question, every time a judgment needed to be rendered or a path chosen, Hönir's mouth would close until Mímir could whisper counsel into his ear. The Vanir began to see this as betrayal. They had been given as hostage a god who could not act without another god's constant instruction. They had been insulted, they had been deceived, and so the Vanir took their answer. They rose in Hönir's presence, and they beheaded Mímir. They sent Mimir's severed head back to Asgard, a message in flesh and blood, a reminder that the Æsir's gift had come defective, or that the Vanir's sense of insult had become uncontainable. Odin received it as it arrived, and instead of declaring new war, already too much blood had watered the world tree, he took his wisest hostage's greatest gift and made it permanent. He treated the head with herbs and magic, with spells that would hold it against rot and time. And the head, even severed, even stripped of its body, continued to speak. It continued to hold all the knowledge it had ever possessed. It continued to know the past and the future. Mímir, beheaded by his own allies, became even more valuable to Odin than he had been alive, a source of secret counsel, consulted whenever Odin needed to know what no other being could tell him. In the world that came after, in the narrative time of the myths proper, Odin would reach back to that severed head again and again whenever the threads of fate grew too tangled to read. And even in the very end, when Ragnarok came and the world burned, when the stars fell and Bifrost shattered and the earth sank into the sea, the sources would have Odin consulting that head one final time, asking it the questions only Mímir could answer. The head, after all, was the closest thing the Æsir still possessed to the wisdom of the Vanir, a reminder that peace is purchased by mutilation, and that knowledge persists even in destruction. But Kvasir, the peace itself, the god made from spittle and accord, would not endure so well. The dwarves Fjalar and Gala, creatures of stone and craft, murdered him. There is no elaborate story around it. The sources do not explain their motive beyond the simple fact that they wanted his blood. They killed him, and they caught every drop of it, and they brewed it. That precious, irreplaceable blood of the wisest being the two divine families had ever jointly created, with honey into the mead of poetry. They poured it into vessels and hid it, and the mead sat in the dark, potent beyond measure, waiting. This mead would pass to the giant Suttungr, and then Odin himself, the god whose court poets would eventually preserve every word of the myths we now tell. Odin in a disguise, with a different name, using guile and seduction and theft, would take the mead back to Asgard in the shape of an eagle. He drank it, he carried it home, and in the very medium of that theft and return, in the mead itself, lay a prophecy none of the gods could have foreseen. The wisdom born of their peace had died, but its blood had become the vehicle of poetry itself. The very words the Norse peoples would use to remember their gods. The meter, the metaphor, the image, the kenning. All of it had been purchased by Kvasir's death and transformed into verse. The surviving sources were written in verse. The surviving sources were written in the blood of the peace. There is one figure in the war's aftermath whom the sources promise a strange fate. Hœnir, the speaker who could not speak without counsel, the hostage whom the Vanir beheaded his own companion for refusing to rely on, was a survivor. The sources do not tell us how he escaped the Vanir's disgrace, or whether he even did. But the seeress who prophesied the end of the world when she looked forward into the flames of Ragnarök saw Hœnir there. She saw him after the stars had fallen. She saw him standing in the renewed world, casting the sacred lots for divination among the survivors. The most humiliated figure of the war's aftermath, mocked for his weakness, orphaned by his partner's death, betrayed by circumstance and destiny, would be one of the very few gods the sources explicitly promise would outlast the end of everything. The mockery, it seemed, would not be final, and the cosmos, it seemed, would still need a speaker. The peace held. But peace in the north is never free, and the price walked through the gates of Asgard, carrying 3 names. The hostages who came to Asgard from the Vanir were not lesser gods. They were not exiles. They were the highest of their kind, sent to seal a peace that neither side could break in any other way. But they arrived marked by their foreignness, by their origin in a realm the Æsir had just finished warring against, by their status as surety. They were fully integrated into the pantheon, and yet never fully absorbed. Freyr, above all, carries this mark while the sources grant him almost every honor. In Snorri's account, in the book called Gylfaginning, Freyr is called the most renowned of all the Æsir. He is described in language that lifts him beyond all peers. He rules over rain and sunshine. He holds dominion over the fruit of the earth, over the harvest, over the fertility and abundance upon which the world's survival rests. He possesses treasures that no other god commands, a golden boar named Gulimbursti that outruns any horse through air and sea alike, and a ship named Skidbladnir that is so cleverly made it can hold all of the Æsir and all of the Einherjar within its hull, and yet folds like a piece of cloth when it is not needed. He is the chief of the Æsir. He is the presiding god. He is the most powerful. But 2 chapters earlier in that same book, Snorri himself writes something that undermines every word of that description. He writes that Freyr's father, Njörðr, is not of the race of the Æsir at all. Njörðr was reared in Vanaheim, in the realm of the Vanir, in the alien land. He was given to the gods as a hostage, sent to the Æsir after the first war in an exchange of surety. Freyr's very blood is alien. Freyr is Æsir by residence and by residence alone, and the poetic Edda confirms it. In that older source, in the verse that survived before Snorri arranged it into prose, Njörðr is independently attested as a god of Vanaheim, not born Ægir, but made Ægir by treaty. Here is the thesis of this pantheon compressed into a single figure. It is the most renowned of all gods, and the sources hold both facts about him simultaneously and see no contradiction. The pantheon absorbed the Vanir so thoroughly that Snorri could describe the son of a hostage as the chief of the Æsir without apparent awareness of what he had said. But Freyr himself was aware. His story proves it. Freyr sat in the high place, Odin's seat, the position of greatest sight in all the 9 worlds. From Hlidskjalf, that throne, a god can see into every realm. Every corner of existence becomes clear. Every hidden thing becomes visible. And from that seat, Freyr's eye fell upon a giantess named Njörðr. She was not of the Æsir. She was not of the worlds that the Æsir held dominion over. She was a being of frost and stone, a dweller in the dark places, beautiful in the way that danger is beautiful. And Freyr saw her, and love struck him like an arrow. The love unmade him. He could not eat. He could not sleep. He walked through the halls of Asgard while his power drained away, while his authority as the most renowned god dissolved into desperation. He sent his servants to find someone who might help. They returned with Skirnir, his own attendant, a being of ambiguous nature who would do things that Freyr himself could not do or could not admit to doing. Skirnir went to Njörðr in her father's hall, deep in the realm where frost giants held dominion. And Skirnir did not come to woo. He came armed. He carried a magic wand, a stick carved with runes and power, capable of imposing the will of the wielder on any being who heard its threat. Skirnir stood before Njörðr and made the threat plain. Accept the marriage, accept Freyr's claim, or I will wither your beauty and curse your lineage and strike you down where you stand. The threat was not subtle. The sources do not soften it. Njörðr surrendered to the threat, and she promised the marriage. She named the night when she would come to Freyr, some time in the future, a marriage delayed, a union sealed by coercion. And Freyr, in his gratitude to Skirnir, in his need to reward the god who had won him what love could not, gave away his sword. Not some lesser weapon, not a decoration. His magical sword, the one that wielded itself in battle, that struck true no matter the circumstances, that had made him the warrior he was. He gave it away. The sources record what came of that bargain. The Æsir and the Vanir would hold many wars after their first peace fractured. Freyr would walk into those battles without his sword, armed only with an antler that he wielded as a weapon, striking blows that looked almost comic in comparison to the power he might have commanded. And when Ragnarok came, when the world burned and the stars fell and the cosmos itself collapsed into chaos, when the fire giant Surtur came riding through the broken sky, his sword blazing with fire hotter than the sun, Freyr stood to face him. Freyr fought. The sources say he fought fiercely, but he had no sword, and Surtur was the destruction of the world itself, and Freyr fell without his weapon, defenseless, because he had given his sword away to win the hand of a giantess through coercion. The love that unmade him, and the desire that took his sword, and the coercion that sealed his marriage, all of it led to his death at the very end of time, when he would have had the greatest need of the weapon he no longer possessed. Njörðr, Freyr's father, the god of the sea and winds, the god of wealth and fishing, lived his own version of this fractured integration. He too was Vanir by birth, sent to the Æsir as a hostage after the First War, his kinship to the Æsir made by treaty and residence rather than blood, and the Æsir, to seal his integration, arranged for him to marry Skaði, a powerful being in her own right, a giantess whose father had been killed in the conflicts between the realms. But the marriage was never stable. It was never whole. Njörðr loved the seashore, the sound of the waves, the taste of salt, the rolling horizons of water that had been his realm in Vanaheim. These were home to him. He could not survive long away from them, but Skaði loved the snowy mountains, the peaks, the cold, the crystalline silence of the high places. These were where her soul resided. She could not live in the lowlands. She could not breathe the warm air of the shore. And so they could not live together. They arranged to spend 9 nights in one place, and then 9 nights in the other, and they would rotate between the domains they loved. Skaði in the mountains, where Njörðr could not bear to stay, Njörðr at the shore where Skaði slowly went mad. A marriage sealed by treaty, a union that was supposed to bind 2 realms together, became a perpetual exile for both parties. The marriage of sea and mountain, the 2 incompatible domains, could never rest. Neither could find comfort in the arms of the other, because what they loved was not each other, but the places they could not both inhabit. But the hostages were never promised comfort. They were promised only integration. And so they integrated. Below Freyja in the hierarchy of the pantheon, barely named in the sources beyond a single poem, were 2 attendants, Bigvir and Bela. They were married to each other. They served Freyja in his hall, and they appear in the surviving texts in exactly one place, in the poem called Lokasena, the flighting of Loki, the moment when that trickster god came to a feast and stood in the center of the hall, mocking every god one by one, dragging out every secret, every shame, every hidden wound. Bigvir appears in that poem as someone who has ground grain for the feast's ale, honest labor, the work that keeps a household alive. And Loki mocks him for it, calls him a cowardly hanger-on who hides at threshing time when the real work of the harvest comes. Bela appears and is insulted as filthy, as beneath the dignity of the moment, as the kind of servant who should not even be present when gods are speaking. And then they vanish from the sources entirely. They are never named again. They have no story beyond that single insult. Scholars read them as personifications, Bigvir as the embodiment of barley work, Bela as the embodiment of dairy-making, household and farm labor, given just enough presence in the mythic sources to be named and then forgotten. They are the floor of the pantheon, not its ceiling. They are what it looks like when divine status means almost nothing at all. And yet they are named. And yet they speak, and yet they exist in the records at all, which means that somewhere, at some point in the Norse world, in the oral traditions that survived into Snorri's time, someone thought these figures mattered enough to remember. And we remember them now, across 1,000 years, only because they were mocked and dismissed in a single poem. The hostages who came to Asgard transformed the pantheon. They did not come as conquering forces, and they were not absorbed passively. They came as sureties, as bridges between worlds, as gods who would walk between 2 families and hold them together through kinship and marriage and the stubborn fact of their presence. Njörðr found a husband in the mountains he could never quite accept. Freyja found a bride through coercion that would cost him everything when the end came. Bygvir and Bela found that serving the high gods meant being remembered for a single insult. And the pantheon, watching all of this, held together, fractured but functional, integrated but marked, united by war and exhaustion, and the slow, stubborn work of binding former enemies into a single, impossible family. One of those hostages became the most powerful goddess in the north, and the most thoroughly misremembered. But Freyja, she arrives with her brother and father, a surety for the peace, and from that moment onward, she stands at the precipice of two worlds. She is a Vanir goddess, housed among the Æsir, a woman who speaks the language of magic that the Æsir did not know, a figure whose sovereignty over fate itself will unsettle every hierarchy that tries to contain her. The texts rank her equally with Frigg, which is almost unprecedented, not below Frigg, not as an attendant or a handmaiden or a daughter learning from a mother. Equally, and where Frigg dwells in the hall called Asgard with her husband Odin, Freyja has claimed a realm entirely her own. She has built a hall called Sessrumnir in a place called Folkvangr, and when battles are fought, when warriors fall, the slain are divided. Odin chooses his portion, the greatest warriors, the poets, the men he might still use in his schemes. But half of all the battle dead, half of the slain of every war that ever rages on the earth, come to Freyja's hall instead. She does not inherit them from Odin. She does not wait for his leavings. She chooses them. She owns them. The woman who arrived as a hostage holds sway over the dead. Most of what we know of her comes down through Snorri, and what Snorri preserves is tangled with her grief. Freyja is the most famous of the goddesses, he says, and the fame that follows her is not triumph, but longing. She is married to a god named Odr, and Odr leaves. The texts do not elaborate. He simply walks away, and Freyja searches for him across nations, across the burning lands and the cold lands, everywhere men have given names to the earth. And as she walks, she weeps. She weeps real tears, and where they fall, they become gold, not metaphorically. Gold. The myth says it plainly. She weeps tears of red gold. Imagine the mathematics of that grief. Imagine a woman so wealthy in sorrow that her tears are precious metal. The Æsir take notice not of her pain, but of its value. They name the gold after what she has lost. What is Odr? The name means desire, fury, poetic inspiration. It is the root that gave its name to Odin himself, and scholars have long sensed something uncanny in that. Some have argued that Odr and Odin were once the same god, that the texts preserve a doubling, a figure split into two by the centuries. The evidence is thin, the sources are too sparse to say for certain, but the possibility unsettles everything. If Freyja's absent husband and Frigg's present one are the same god wearing two names, then the pantheon is not merely fragmentary. It is structurally unstable, rebuilt by centuries of retelling into something that almost but never quite makes sense. Think of it this way. Frigg sits in Asgard with Odin, the All-Father, holding the secrets of the future. Freyja weeps for Odr, who left and will not return. If these are not two different gods, but one figure doubled by time, then the mythology contains an impossible truth. The same deity is simultaneously present and absent, married to two different goddesses, the mainstay of one marriage and the source of eternal grief in another. The stories cannot accommodate what the names might mean. Odr remains an absence. He is mentioned only because Freyja mentions him. He has no story of his own, no narrative, no action except to have left. He is the god with nothing behind his name. And yet Freyja's power does not depend on him. Even as she grieves, she teaches the magic that the Æsir did not know, the practice called seiðr, the art of prophecy and transformation and commanding spirits, was known among the Vanir, and Freyja was its priestess. She brought it to the Æsir. She taught them. Seiðr is a strange magic, gendered feminine, worked by those who leave the body or pull visions down from elsewhere. It is not the magic of craft or battle. It is the magic of seeing what is not yet born, of speaking to powers that move in the hidden places. Freyja stands as the authority on ecstatic power, on a register of knowing that is not Odin's ravens or Odin's runes, but something older and stranger, something she brought from the war itself. She wears the necklace Brisingamen, one of the few objects in the Norse pantheon that carries its own prestige. The texts do not dwell on it. It is simply hers. It simply matters. And she has daughters, or rather, she has a name, and through that name, a kind of immortality. Hnoss, the texts say, is Freyja's child with her absent husband. She is so beautiful that anything precious or beautiful came to be called Hnossir after her. A common noun born from a goddess's daughter, the same way that Tuesday and Wednesday carry the names of old gods into every week. The word outlived the story. The name remained even when the narrative was lost. But there is a problem in the texts. They also mention another daughter, Gersemi, and Gersemi's name is precisely synonymous with Hnoss. Gersemi means treasure. Hnoss means treasure. They have the same meaning, the same etymology. And Gersemi appears exactly once in the name lists in the prose Edda as Hnoss's sister. She has no story. She has no independent attestation. Some scholars suspect they are not two goddesses at all, but one goddess, doubled in the surviving texts, the same figure called by two words that mean the same thing. The roster itself inflates. The silence is not just in what was lost, it is in what was never separated. Hnoss and Gersemi might be the same being, remembered and forgotten and remembered again, or they might be two sisters whose stories have entirely perished. The texts do not say, but there is another layer to her power that the texts almost bury. When the Vanir came to the Æsir as hostages, there was an exchange of knowledge. The Vanir knew seiðr, the magic of prophecy and spiritism, the ecstatic arts, and Freyja carried that knowledge into Asgard. She taught it to gods who had conquered the world with spear and battle cunning, but did not know how to see beyond the next dawn. Seiðr is a strange register of power. It is not the commanding force of Odin's ravens, circling the earth to bring him news. It is not the craft of runes scratched into bone and wood. It is the magic of otherness, of leaving your own body, of speaking to powers that move in the hidden places, of seeing what the normal senses cannot reach. Freyja stood as the priestess of this art. She remains its authority. And in teaching it to the Æsir, she did not diminish herself. She made herself indispensable. This is one way power moves in a divine society, not through force alone, but through knowledge that others need, through secrets that only you carry. The grief, meanwhile, never stops. Even as she stands among the Æsir, teaching them mysteries, choosing the dead, wearing the necklace Brisingamen, she is always listening for the footfall of Ullr. And he does not come. The texts preserve her as the goddess of eternal longing. This is not diminishment. This is her complexity. She is not less powerful for grieving. She is not less dangerous for missing someone. Freyja is the goddess who is simultaneously sovereign in her own right and grieving for something lost. Her daughters carry her name into the future, but in a way that nearly erases her. Norse becomes a word. The name becomes so ordinary, so universal, that it no longer points to a goddess. It points to anything precious, anything rare. Ask a Viking merchant about his most valuable goods, and he might call them Nosir, treasures, without knowing he was invoking Freyja's daughter. And if Gersemi is real, if she is not simply Hnoss called by another name, a scribal accident or a poetic doubling, then she too is lost in the same way, her story buried under the identical meaning of her name. They exist in language, but not in narrative. They are known and forgotten simultaneously. This is the gap we have been circling from the beginning. Hnoss is famous enough that her name became common, so common that nobody remembers she was a goddess. Gersemi is so obscure that she appears only once in a list, and scholars cannot agree whether she is one goddess or two. The recording of mythology is not a neutral act. What survives for reasons that have nothing to do with how important a god actually was. A name that becomes a word forgets its origin. A goddess who receives no stories is even more thoroughly erased than one whose stories are lost. Freyja's daughters are proof of this. They are immortal in language. They are extinct in narrative. Freyja stands in the hall of the Æsir, then as a woman of paradox and precision. She chooses the dead. She teaches magic. She grieves a god who may or may not be Odin, wearing a different name. She wears a necklace that commands respect. She has daughters whose names became words, whose stories became vocabulary, whose very immortality is the vehicle of their oblivion. She arrives at Asgard as a hostage for the peace, and she ends by holding power that Odin himself does not hold. She is equal to Frigg, not below her, not learning from her, but her equal. She stands at the level of the All-Mother, while everyone else, gods and mortals and poets, recording the stories, focus on her grief. They miss her power. They always have. No profile can contain her. No list can hold what she is. Every family has one member who will end it. This one was numbered among the gods and fathered the things that would eat them. Loki moves among the Æsir, and there is something broken in his right to be there. He is numbered among them, invited to their feasts, consulted in their councils, a rescuer when his cunning alone can untangle a disaster. But his father is the giant Farbauti, a Jötun, one of the race that the gods fought in war. His mother is Laufey, and the sources do not tell us what Laufey is. Whether she is a giantess, a daughter of the Æsir, something else entirely. All we know is the naming. Loki is not called by his father's name in the way gods are usually named. He is called Laufeyjason, the son of Laufey, using his mother's name instead of his father's, a metronymic. Even in how he is named, he breaks the convention. He is fair of face, the texts say, but evil in disposition, treacherous and fickle-minded. He causes trouble for the gods. He rescues them. He will destroy them all. At some point, the chronology is lost. Loki takes a giantess as his consort. Her name is Angerboda. The union is not celebrated. It is not part of the normal kinship that binds the divine families together. And from Loki and Angerboda, 3 children are born. The first is Fenrir, a wolf, not a god who can sometimes take the form of a wolf. A wolf, pure and entire. The second is Jörmungandr, the Midgard serpent. The Odin cast this thing into the deep sea surrounding all lands, the ocean that encircles the earth itself, and there it grew and grew until it became so immense that its body circles the entire world, and it bites its own tail and lies in the sea that is its own prison. It is the boundary of all known things. One day the Æsir will understand. It will also be the rope by which Ragnarok binges the earth back into chaos. The third is Hel, and Hel is a being of contradiction. Odin cast Hel into Niflheim, the realm of fog and cold, and there she rules. She governs 9 worlds, 9 vast regions of death and cold. The gods appointed her to receive everyone who dies of sickness or old age, the slow diminishments, the illnesses, the years that gather until a body gives out. And this is the terrible mathematics of her existence. She is not a monster to be feared, but a necessary function, a keeper of the dead, necessary and terrible and fully legitimate within the order of things. But Fenrir is a wolf that will grow large enough to swallow Odin at the end of the world. It must be bound. The gods are certain of this. They are horrified. They begin with lading. It is a strong fetter, made well, and they bring it to Fenrir, and they say, "Test your strength. See if you are as mighty as you seem." And Fenrir strains against lading, and lading breaks. The wolf walks free. They make Dromi, a second fetter, even stronger. They bring it to Fenrir, and they say, "Try this one." And Fenrir strains against Dromi, and Dromi breaks. The wolf walks free again. Now the gods are desperate. They have a plan. They have heard, or one of them has learned, of a thing that the dwarves can make. Something woven from 6 impossible materials. The footfall of a cat, which is silent and leaves no trace. The beard of a woman, which does not exist. The roots of a mountain, which go nowhere and are immovable. The sinews of a bear, which are its strength. The breath of a fish, which is water and air at once, and the spittle of a bird. From these 6 things that cannot be real, the dwarves forge Gleipnir. Gleipnir is soft, like silk, like the gossamer of dreams. But it cannot be broken. It is the solution to the impossible problem. How do you bind a thing that is always growing, always becoming more, always stronger than the last restraint? The answer is not strength. The answer is something woven from what does not exist. They bring Gleipnir to Fenrir, but the wolf is wise. It does not trust them. It sees the soft fetter and it smells something in the air. Magic. The mark of the impossible. The knowledge that this is a trap. And Fenrir says to them, "I will not let you bind me with this unless one of you places a hand in my mouth as a pledge, as a promise that if I cannot break this fetter, you will release me." No one moves. No one speaks. The gods look at each other in the hall of Asgard, and they understand what is being asked. The wolf will bite. The wolf will take the hand that is offered. The gods will keep their oath, which means the hand will not be given back. Tyr steps forward. Tyr, the god of law and oath, the god of justice and order. He is the one who understands that a promise is a promise, that the order of things holds only if the words that bind it are kept. He puts his hand in the wolf's mouth. The gods bind Fenrir with Gleipnir. The wolf strains. Gleipnir holds. And when Fenrir realizes he is truly bound, when he understands that there is no breaking this, that it is not something he can test and escape, he closes his jaws. He bites Tyr's hand off at the wrist. The hand is gone, glittering with blood, severed at the wrist. Tyr takes up his arm stump, and he is changed. He is forever after the one-handed god. His sacrifice is permanent. It will not heal. It will not return. He walks among the Æsir with only one hand, and that wound tells the story of how much the gods have had to give to hold back the chaos they know is coming. Fenrir snarls in his bonds. He pulls at Gleipnir, but Gleipnir does not budge. There is rope tethering the wolf to a stone bedrock called Gjöll, and there the wolf will lie until Ragnarök comes. Fenrir is bound, but the binding has cost not just rope and dwarven magic, but a god's hand, a god's wholeness, a god's permanent sacrifice, and now to Loki himself. He is the father of the wolf. He is the consort of Angerboda. And by his own actions, or by the judgment of the gods, who finally lose patience with his shape-shifting, his interference, his hand in Baldur's death, he is brought before the council, and the gods have decided on his punishment. They take Loki's other son, not Fenrir, but Narfi, born of Loki and his wife Sigyn. They transform the boy into a wolf, and the wolf that was Narfi tears apart his brother, tearing into Loki's true-born son from his marriage to Sigyn, and the blood falls. The gods take Narfi's entrails, his very gut, still warm, still wet with death, and they bind Loki across 3 stones, 1 stone under his shoulders, 1 under his loins, 1 under his knees, and they bind him there with Narfi's own entrails, transformed into iron. His son becomes the rope that holds him. And then the gods take a serpent, a venomous serpent, and they place it above Loki's face. The serpent hangs there, and its venom drips, and it drips onto his face, drop by drop by drop, the burning poison of the creature's saliva. But Sigyn, Loki's wife, does not abandon him. She sits beside him. She holds a bowl above his face to catch the venom before it falls on him. She holds the bowl and she catches the poison, and Loki lies in his bonds, and the venom does not touch him, not while she holds her post, until the bowl fills. And it always fills. And when it fills, Sigyn must empty it, must turn away for just a moment, and in that moment, the venom falls on Loki's face, and the pain is so great that he writhes. He convulses against the iron entrails that bind him, and when Loki writhes, the earth itself shakes. Earthquakes, tremors, the ground heaves. This is Loki's end in the texts as they survive, bound with the guts of his own son, venom dripping, rescued, and then abandoned by his wife's loyal presence, wreathing in agony, making the earth itself scream his anguish until Ragnarök ends everything. He was numbered among the Æsir once. He walked in their hall. He was fair-faced and clever and useful and necessary and treacherous. And the price of the gods keeping him among them, of allowing this half-giant into their order, was to forge 3 fetters, to demand a god's hand, to transform a boy into a wolf, to take a man's intestines and make them chains, to cover the world in a poison so painful that it will not stop shaking even when all other things have ended. The binding of Fenrir cost Tyr his hand. The binding of Loki costs the gods their certainty that order can be held forever. Both are permanent. Both will endure until the end of the world. Sigyn does not leave her post. She sits there through centuries, through ages, through all the years that separate the binding from Ragnarök. Her arm must ache. The bowl must be heavy. And when it fills and she must turn away, just for a moment, just long enough to empty the venom, she knows what will happen. She knows the pain that will make the earth quake. She knows that her husband will scream, and she returns to hold the bowl again anyway. This is the marriage that the texts preserve, not romance, loyalty that outlasts everything, even the certainty of pain. Sigyn chooses to sit there. She chooses over and over again to remain. These are the gods who will face Ragnarök. They are already diminished. Tyr is one-handed. Loki is bound beneath the earth, waiting for the day his fetters break. Sigyn will hold her bowl until the moment the Fimbulwinter begins and all bonds fail. The Æsir did not defeat chaos. They postponed it. They bought time with sacrifice, a god's hand, a god's son, a wife's eternal vigilance. They wove an impossible fetter from things that do not exist, and they believe it will hold until the world ends. But they know in their divine hearts that it will not hold forever. Nothing holds forever. Even Gleipnir is temporary. Even Sigyn's loyalty is a counterattack, not a victory. When Ragnarök comes, Fenrir will break his bonds. Loki will rise. Sigyn will step away from the bowl for the last time. The serpent's venom will fall without interruption, and the wolf and the trickster and all the monstrous children born from outsider blood will be free. For now, though, the fetter holds. For now, the world stands on top of these wounds. The wolf is bound. The clock is running. And the gods still have a watchman, a poet, and a woman whose apples are the only reason any of them are still young. At the far reaches of the Norse cosmos, where the burning rainbow bridge Bifrost connects the 9 realms, stands Heimdallr. He is the god of boundaries and perception, the eternal sentinel. The Eddas describe him in terms that strain language, born of 9 maiden sisters, so attuned to vigilance that he needs less sleep than a bird. His eyes pierce 100 miles in every direction, whether the sun lights the world or the stars preside over darkness. He hears not merely sound, but its whisper. The grass growing in the fields, the wool thickening on sheep's backs. Every small shift at the margin of existence reaches his consciousness. In his hand rests the Gjallarhorn, a call so potent it will shake all 9 realms when finally he sounds it. But he knows what that moment means. Heimdallr alone is eternal watchfulness because he alone knows the moment he's waiting for, the breaking of the worlds. He stands at his post knowing the end, listening for its approach, the most patient of all the gods, because his patience will outlast everything. His role is a solitude without equal. While the other Æsir feast in their halls or rule their domains, Heimdallr remains at the threshold, neither sleeping nor truly resting. The sources emphasize again and again, he needs less sleep than a bird. A bird dozes with one eye open, one half of its mind alert to predation. Heimdallr offers less even than that. His vigilance is not a duty he performs by day and relinquishes by night. It is a constant state, a being perpetually divided between alertness and the mere appearance of rest. His perception operates at a scale other gods do not approach. He sees 100 miles in daylight and 100 miles in darkness alike. There is no direction from which threat can approach unnoticed. The Norse imagination placed at the boundary of their cosmos a god whose sensory reach exceeded time itself. He perceives the future as readily as the immediate present because his senses work at frequencies beyond the mortal. Yet this same god, who never sleeps, who holds the boundary of eternity itself, has another face entirely. The poem Rígstula preserves a narrative so different it seems impossible it could be the same deity, and yet the sources call him Rig, a wanderer who walks the Midgard of humans. Not a sentinel at the end of things, but an architect of the beginning, not remaining at the bridge, but traveling the roads of the human world, staying in houses, sharing beds with mortal women. In 3 nights journeying, staying in 3 houses, he lies with 3 mortal women. 3 nights that beget 3 sons. The poem describes the houses themselves. The first poor and humble, the dwelling of those who knew neither surplus nor comfort. The second, a prosperous farmstead, the home of those who worked the land and had made themselves secure. The third, a noble hall, where wealth and lineage announced themselves in every carved post and woven hanging. And in each house, Frigg lay with a woman, and each union produced a son. From the first union comes Threll, ancestor of all thralls and slaves, the one born into bondage, whose lineage will serve all others. From the second comes Karl, the free farmer, the founder of the peasant class, the one who works his own land and is bound to no master. From the third comes Jarl, the noble, the warrior, the one born to rule, the one for whom all others labor. 3 knights, 3 women, 3 sons, 3 social orders of mankind, each one the ancestor of a class that will persist into recorded history. And then Frigg, still the same god, teaches the youngest son of Jarl the secrets of runes and esoteric knowledge. He gives the boy instruction in the old wisdom, in the marks that hold power, in the knowledge that separates the noble from the common. The poem contains a pun on this boy's name, Connor the Young, where Connor sounds like Konunga, king, as if the Norse myth of kingship itself is a divine joke told only to those who understand the wordplay. The god of perception and boundary reveals himself as the divine architect of human hierarchy itself. 2 lives for one god, the world's eternal watchman and the divine creator of human social order. The corpus holds both, reconciles neither. Bragi enters the story not as a newcomer, but as a husband. He is the god of poetry and eloquence, famous for his flattery, his tongue of silver. He is the bard of the Æsir themselves, skilled beyond measure in the art of composition and speech. The Æsir gather when he speaks. His words seduce, cajole, convince. He is the embodiment of the power that words hold when arranged with care and knowledge. He is the god of the skalds, the patron of those who compose verse and commit memory to sound. And his marriage binds him to one of the most crucial figures in the pantheon, Iðunn, the keeper of the apples. To understand why a god of poetry should be married to a guardian of fruit requires understanding what those apples are and what they do. Iðunn watches over them in a wooden box, not a treasure vault of gold or silver, but a simple chest made of wood. The apples deserve no ornamentation beyond her vigilance. The apples are immortal fruit, the apples of youth, the apples of renewal, the single resource that stands between the gods and the slow decay all immortals fear. Iðunn does not create the apples. She did not generate them in some mythic event recorded in earlier sources. She did not bear them forth or cause them to grow. She merely guards what exists, a pure preserver, a custodian. And that preservation is everything. Without Idunn's vigilance, without her willingness to keep the box secure and portion them out, the gods do not remain eternal. They age. Their bodies weaken. Their power fades. Their strength diminishes year by year. The cosmos' central fact becomes visible through her absence. Immortality is not a gift written into the god's essence, but a dependency, a maintenance requirement that can be cut off, a resource that can be stolen. But dependencies invite theft, and there was one who wanted what Iðunn possessed, the giant Þjazi, one of the frost powers dwelling in the mountains beyond Asgard's boundaries, learned where Iðunn kept her treasure. He watched and waited for his moment. He came to Asgard and took her, not by negotiation or bargain, but by force, by seizure. He carried her away to his realm in Jotunheim. The sources preserve the poem Haustlong, which tells the abduction and recovery as a high dramatic chase. The abduction itself was an act of violence against the divine order. To steal from a goddess was to break the most basic law between the realms. The recovery required Loki, the boundary walker, the one who can slip between forms and states, to take falcon form and pursue Thjazi across the sky. A god in falcon shape, chasing a giant in eagle's form across the expanse above the worlds. The sources preserve this. Loki transforms, Thjazi transforms, and between them the sky itself becomes a battleground. The sequence burned into the mythic landscape. The Æsir lit a fire at the edge of Asgard, flames rising to meet the fleeing giant, flames high enough to catch him as he approached. And Thjazi fell into the fire and was burned to death. The giant who stole the apples of immortality perished in fire, and Iðunn was returned. But here the story turns, as it always does in the north. What was taken must be paid for. The dead giant's daughter Skaði came to Asgard to claim compensation, not as a beggar, but as a creditor. A death demands settlement, and she was the sole heir to Thjazi's house. Before we enter her story, we must see what Idunn's absence had cost in those days, before recovery. The sources record it precisely. The gods, separated from the apples, began to age almost immediately. Gray crept into their hair within hours. Their faces lined within days. Their bodies weakened visibly. Within a short span of time, days, perhaps weeks at most, the accumulated effect became catastrophic. The immortal council of the Æsir convened in panic. They interrogated one another. Who had last seen Iðunn? How could she have vanished? Who is responsible? Who permitted this theft to occur? And all of them turned on Loki with implicit threat. Fix this, or you do not leave this hall alive. Death hung over him as palpably as the gray in their hair. A single kidnapped goddess transformed an entire pantheon into mortals falling toward decrepitude, forcing them to act not from principle, but from the desperation of aging bodies and the terror of mortality pressing down on them. Idunn's capture is a catastrophe precisely because she is not a warrior god or a keeper of wisdom, but a custodian, a gardener whose single resource was non-renewable within Asgard's borders. She is what holds decay at bay. Without her, the gods faced what they had never faced before: time. Bragi and Idunn's marriage is never described in mythic action. It rests as a fact in the genealogy. Yet the pairing contains its own truth. The god of poetry is married to the keeper of renewal. The verses that preserve immortal memory are inseparable in the Norse imagination from the physical immortality the gods must consume. Poetry gives the gods eternal names. Their deeds and their words are carried forward on the tongues of skalds and preserved in written verse. Idunn's apples give them eternal bodies. Without one, glory fades into forgetfulness within generations. Without the other, the body crumbles into age and powerlessness. They are, in effect, two sides of the single resource that allows anything to endure: verbal immortality and physical immortality, bound together in the person of a poet and a guardian. But there is another layer to Bragi's presence in the pantheon, one that illustrates the thesis of this entire episode more sharply than almost any other case. Bragi is the god of poetry. And yet, in the sources, Snorri quotes the verses of a real historical poet named Bragi Boddason, called the Old, who lived in the 9th century. This was a real skald whose compositions survive in Old Norse, whose biographical details are recorded in sagas, whose cultural impact shaped the entire tradition of Norse poetry. Bragi Boddason is not a myth. He is history, a documented figure from the Viking Age, whose own verses were still treasured when Snorri compiled his prose Edda 4 centuries later. Snorri quotes his work repeatedly, citing it as poetic authority on the gods themselves. Yet the god and the poet share a name exactly, and here the sources become opaque. Did the historical skald become deified in the course of transmission, his name lifted into the divine realm, and his historical reality worn away by generations of retelling? Or did the god of poetry exist first, long before the Christian era, and the 9th century poet simply bear a divine name as an honor and a claim to tradition? Or are the two entirely unrelated, bound only by identical naming and Snorri's coincidental juxtaposition of them? The sources will not say. Scholars still debate the direction of the transformation, and no consensus has emerged. Here, within a single god's entry, stands the problem that defines the whole roster. The boundary between myth and history, between the divine and the mortal, is permeable, uncertain, and ultimately unrecoverable. When you look at Bragi, you do not merely see one god among many. You see the source itself breaking down under the weight of its own ambiguity. The giant is dead. His daughter is at the gate, armed and asking to be paid. Skaði arrived at the gates of Asgard as a demand. Her father lay burned in the fire at the edge of the realm, his body ash, his death unpaid. She came as a daughter wronged, a giant with a claim on the gods, not begging for mercy, but asserting the law that bound all the 9 realms. But the Æsir did not deny her right to compensation. They could not. The law between them, even when an Æsir had killed a giant, was exchange and settlement. The cosmos operated on the principle of reciprocity. A death demands payment. The gods offered her a bride price. They would choose her a husband from among their own number. She would be taken into the divine realm, elevated from giantess to goddess, bound by marriage to an Æsir. This was compensation of a high order, but there was a condition written into the bargain, a strange constraint that shaped the entire transaction. Skaði would not see the face of the man she was to marry. She would choose her husband by his feet alone, her eyes fixed downward, her gaze permitted to see only what his body bore below the knee. Why the Æsir imposed this condition, the sources do not say. Perhaps it was a test. Perhaps it was meant to humble her. Perhaps it was a safeguard. If she could not see the god's face, she could not form attachments based on beauty or expression, only on the single visible part. Whatever the reasoning, it was the law of her compensation. Imagine the scene. Skaði, daughter of Frost, standing at the edge of Asgard, her eyes held low, looking downward at the assembled ankles of the gods. They stood in a line, or perhaps in no order. Perhaps she walked among them as they presented themselves. One pair of feet seemed fairer than the others, finer of form, more polished to the eye, not rough or scarred, but delicate and beautiful. She pointed to him and claimed him as her husband. The feet belonged to Njörðr, the god of the sea and wind, the father of the 2 Vanir hostages, Freyr and Freyja, who had come to Asgard as surety after the first war between the divine families. A marriage by footsight, a forced union born of legal obligation, compensation, and the father's death. No courtship, no wooing, no love, only the law and its fulfillment. And here the myth exposes a truth deeper than any plot. Skaði and Njörðr were fundamentally, cosmically incompatible. They were not merely mismatched in personality or preference, they were opposed in essence. She was the daughter of the mountains and the frost, born of the high places where cold lives. She loved the high peaks, the snow, the precipices, the places where only the hardiest survive. The cold wilderness where no warmth penetrated was home to her. Njörðr was the god of the sea, of spray and wind across salt waters, the one who dwelt in the warmth and motion of the open world. His realm was the shore, the coast, the place where wave meets land in endless motion. When they tried to share a life, when the law required them to attempt marriage, they could not. Mountain and ocean cannot dwell in the same place. They meet only at the shore and push against each other there, a boundary of eternal friction. The attempt failed almost immediately. Their natures were too opposed. One required the high cold, one required the warm open water. They could not compromise on dwelling place because their dwellings were not merely preferences, but who they were. Skaði went back to her father's house in Thrymheimr, the hall of the giants, the place of snow and ice and the high realm. Njörðr returned to Nóatún, his hall by the sea, the place of waters and wind. The marriage lasted only as long as law required it to exist. But the compensation was not invalid. It had been paid. And Skaði, having been raised to divine status, remained among the gods despite the failed marriage. But Skaði did not disappear back into the frost realm forever. The sources that preserve the historical narrative Ynglinga Saga, which Snorri presents to us as if it were another layer of the mythic corpus, another way of knowing the divine past, record what happened next. After her failed marriage to Njörðr, Skaði came to Odin himself, and Odin took her as his wife. This was not compensation, this was choice. The chief of the Æsir, the All-Father, the god who sees all and plans all, looked at the giantess-turned-goddess who had been rejected by the sea and decided to bind her to himself. This second marriage was not a law but a passion, or at least an alliance struck between powerful beings who recognized something in each other. This second marriage was fruitful. Skaði bore Odin's sons, and one of them, Jörmungandr, the Saga names as the legendary ancestor of a real historical lineage, the Jarls of Hladir in Norway. Not a myth obscured in time, but a genealogy that could be traced. The men who ruled the Hladir region in recorded history were said to descend from this union between Odin and Skaði. A giantess taken as compensation became, in Snorri's hands, the mythic root of Norwegian nobility. The forced marriage that began in the ashes of her father's death, that failed in the incompatibility of mountain and sea, ended in her bearing sons whose descendants would rule kingdoms. This is Snorri's art, the seamless fusion of myth and dynastic history, making the divine ancestry of a noble house inseparable from the story of a giant daughter who once chose by feet alone and found herself choosing a king. The cosmos does not forget such unions. They echo into recorded time. Yet there is another god in this pantheon whose name fills the landscape, but whose story is nearly empty. Ullr appears in Snorri's canonical list of the Æsir in Gylfaginning. He is described in the brief space Snorri grants him, an excellent archer and ski runner, very handsome in appearance, so swift on skis that no other god can match his speed. That is all the prose Edda offers. That is the total of Ullr's narrative presence in all the sources that survived to reach us. A god described in 3 lines and then abandoned. No myth, no story, no event in which he acts. Only attributes and a place in a list. Yet when you travel through Scandinavia, through Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, the landscape itself becomes Ullr's autobiography written in the names of places. Archaeologists and place name scholars count more than 50 place names derived from the god's name. Ullrestad, Ullagruvan, Ullaroka, Ullared, Ullarup, Ullarupmark, names that cluster across the land. These are not new names created by Christian conversion or modern invention. These are old names, place names that preserve the memory of worship and invocation, names given by people who knew the god and called on him. He was venerated widely and deeply in pre-Christian times. The geography says so. The names carved into the land by worshippers speak louder than the poets did. The Norse people who lived in these places, who worked and died there, remembered Ullr enough to attach his name to their homes. The map preserves what the texts have erased. And here lies one of the sharpest illustrations of this episode's central thesis. The gods of the written sources are not the gods of the people. The Æsir we know by name and story are the gods of kings, of courts, of the skalds who composed verse in noble halls, and whose compositions were eventually written down in Latin letters and preserved in Snorri's book. Ullr, beloved enough to warrant 50 place names across 3 nations, disappeared from the mythology because his worshippers were ordinary people whose prayers were never recorded in Sága. The farmer invoking Ullr before the hunt, the family calling on him in winter, the skier asking his aid on dangerous slopes. None of this was written down. It survived only in names, in the marks people left on the land. Within Thor's household, Snorri places Ullr as the son of Sif and the stepson of the god of thunder himself. Sif was Thor's wife, and she had a son. That much is established. Yet Ullr's father, the one who fathered him on Sif, is never named anywhere in the surviving corpus. A genealogical thread stated flatly and never followed up. Sif had a son before Thor. The son was Ullr. That is all that surfaces. Everything else is silence. The father's identity is lost. His name never appears in the sources. A god is part of the divine realm because Snorri's list includes him, because Sif is Thor's wife and must have had lineage, because the geography of Scandinavia remembers his name so persistently it cannot be ignored. But the myth never tells us who his father was, never explains the relationship, never gives us the story that would make sense of his place in Thor's hall. He is part of the cosmic structure because the geography will not let him go. The place names hold him. 50 locations across 3 kingdoms refuse to forget him, and yet the literary tradition has almost abandoned him, reducing him to a single line in a list and a few scattered references. Ullr is the clearest proof that the gods we inherit are the gods the poets could reach, not the gods the people knew. The ones whose stories made it into verse are richly attested. The ones whose names live on in the land are nearly erased. The roster we have is a survivors list. The voices of power that made it to ink, filtered through courts and composed into verse, written down by a Christian looking back at a pagan world through the lens of his own time. What remains is what the scribes could catch. Everything else is place names on a map. Everything so far has been a society under strain. Now comes the death that breaks it. Balder is not a warrior or a trickster. He is beauty itself, the most handsome of the gods, beloved by all beings in the cosmos. That beauty becomes a paradox. When Frigg hears of his terrible dream, a dream that foreshadows his own death, she moves with the determination of a mother who will not accept mortality. She travels through all creation and extracts from every living thing an oath, a promise that none will harm her son. From every plant, from every stone, from every disease, from iron and fire and water. The oath binds the world, all things swear. But in the gathering of promises, one thing was overlooked. The mistletoe was deemed too young, too insignificant to call upon. That oversight is not carelessness. It is destiny preparing a throat for the knife. The oaths make Balder invulnerable in the physical world. The gods test this at their assembly. They hurl weapons at him. They strike with swords. They cast stones, and nothing touches him. The weapons turn aside. The stones fall harmless. Balder stands in the center of the hall, unscathed and gleaming, while all around him the gods laugh at the impossible strength of Frigg's oath. It is a scene of safety, almost of triumph, and it is also a scene of blindness, because among the gods sits Loki, watching, and what Loki watches, Loki corrupts. Loki moves with the precision of malice. He seeks out Hödr, also called Hoda, the blind son of Odin. Hödr stands apart because he cannot see what his brothers are doing, cannot cast at a target he cannot perceive. Loki approaches him with false warmth, with the voice of a friend. He tells Hödr that he should join the sport, that he should throw something at Balder as the others do. But Hödr has no weapon, no stone. He stands in darkness, blind to the hall around him. And Loki, with a gesture that is almost gentle, places in his hands a sprig of mistletoe. The mistletoe, the one thing that was overlooked, the one thing that swore no oath, the one thing that sleeps in the mistrust between mother and son. Loki guides Hödr's hand. Loki guides his aim, and Hödr casts. The mistletoe flies through the hall. It pierces Balder through. The god who was invulnerable falls dead. The cosmos fractures in that moment. The laughter stops. The hall empties into grief. All beings weep for Balder. Gods and giants, dwarves and men, all creation dissolves into sorrow, because Balder was so beloved that his death is the death of beauty itself. And from that grief comes a deeper grief. Nanna, Balder's wife, dies of the shock and sorrow. She dies of nothing but heartbreak. And in the Norse custom, her body is placed on the pyre with Balder's, to follow him into whatever comes next. The two of them will burn together, will leave the world together, will go into death as they were bound in life. But before the pyre can be lit, the gods must move Balder's body to the ship. They carry him to Hringhorni, the greatest of all ships, so vast and so heavy that it was built to carry the dead god into the realm of death and beyond. Yet when they try to push it out to sea, when they gather their strength and their divine power, the ship does not move. Not one god can shift it. All the gods together cannot move it. And this is the moment when the gods' power is most naked, most exposed as insufficient. They are the rulers of 9 worlds, the architects of the cosmos, and they cannot push a ship. They send to Jotunheim, to the realm of the giants, and they call for Hyrrokin. She comes, a giantess of such size and such strength that when she rides, the earth trembles. She rides on a wolf with vipers for reins, and the very sight of her is terrible. But it is also salvation. Hyrrokin walks to the ship, puts her hand against it with the casual strength of a giant, and shoves. The ship launches. It moves out to sea, Flames leap from the rollers. The earth shakes from the violence of her push. And as the ship slides away, as Baldr's body begins its journey, Thor stands on the shore, and his grief curdles into rage. He raises Mjolnir, his hammer, his fury made manifest. He needs to consecrate the pyre, to send Baldr into death with the blessing of the war god. He raises his hammer to do it. But in that moment, a dwarf named Lita scurries at his feet, perhaps to steal, perhaps by accident, and Thor, ablaze with grief and anger, kicks him into the fire. The dwarf burns, a small, senseless violence at the edge of a cosmic tragedy, one tiny death nested inside a greater one. But the death of Baldr is not the end. It becomes the beginning of a new sequence. Hermod, Baldr's brother, the bold son of Odin, saddles Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse that can cross between worlds, and rides to Niflheim, to the Hall of Hel. The gates are black, the river is cold, but Hermod rides. He crosses the boundary between the living and the dead, and he comes before Hel herself, the queen of death, half beautiful and half decayed, and he makes his plea, release Baldr. Release the beautiful god. All things in the 9 worlds have wept for him. All beings know his loss. Let him return. Hel listens. She is not without mercy. She agrees on one condition. If all things in the world weep for Baldr, if all creation grieves as one, then he will return. He will walk back into the light. The condition seems almost easy. Everything already weeps. Everything already grieves. What in all creation would not mourn Baldr? But there is one. There is always one. Somewhere in the realm, there is a giantess named Thok, or a troll, or a creature whose nature is ambiguous and terrible. And Thok will not weep. Thok refuses. Whether from malice or from the ancient enmity between the powers of death and the powers of life, Thok holds grief back. She will not give the tears that the cosmos needs to ransom Baldr from death. And with that refusal, the bargain collapses. Baldr remains in Niflheim. He does not return. The attempt to reverse death, to undo fate, fails utterly. Yet from this failure comes a strange and terrible birth. Out of grief, Odin takes a woman named Rind, and from their union a son is born. Vali is that son, and he is born for a single, terrible purpose. He is born to avenge. And Vali grows with the speed of myth, not of nature. He reaches manhood in a single day. In that single day, he takes no time to eat, takes no time to sleep, but arms himself and finds Hoda. Hoda, the blind god who was used, who was the instrument but not the architect of Baldr's death. And Vali, without hesitation or mercy, slays him. Thus the cycle closes. Baldr is mourned, Hermod's mission fails, Vali is born and grows and kills, and the cosmos is fractured in a new way. The gods have lost their most beloved member. They have failed to ransom him. They have taken vengeance, but vengeance does not restore what was lost. It only deepens the wound, and yet, from Baldr and Nanna, even in death, comes one more god. For Seti, god of reconciliation, is born of that dead couple. He inherits a hall called Glitnir with a silver roof, and his sole function is to hear the complaints of all beings and reconcile them, to settle the disputes that arise from the wounds of loss. In a cosmos broken by death, Forseti offers something that might heal the break. Not reversal, not undoing, but the possibility of settlement between those at odds. Whether such settlement can ever mend the wound that Baldr's death has torn into the fabric of the divine society, the texts do not say. The god of reconciliation is born into a cosmos where reconciliation may be impossible. The center of the pantheon has been named. But the Norse cosmos does not stop at the walls of Asgard. As the pantheon spreads outward from Odin and his peers, the narratives thin. The attested facts dwindle. And at the very edges of the roster, in the places where the text gives you a name and almost nothing else, you find yourself asking, what was lost? What did the Icelanders know but fail to write down? What did the oral tradition remember but leave no trace in parchment? The edges begin with the sea. Ægir is not quite a god and not quite a giant. He is a being of the boundary between the divine and the wild. He is the giant of the sea, and his role in the divine society is precise and essential. He brews ale for the gods. He hosts feasts so vast that gods and giants mingle, feast, and drink together. He is incorporated into the social structure through hospitality, through the provision of abundance. He is Ægir, the ally. But Ægir is also the father of the waves. He has 9 daughters: Himin, Dufa, Blodurada, Hefring, Ullr, Hrön, Bilgja, Bara, Kolga, each a personification of a different motion of the sea. The ocean's violence is his lineage. The gods feast at his table, but they do so knowing that he commands forces that can drown armies. And at Ægir's side is Rán. She is his wife, a giantess of the sea who embodies the ocean's predatory face. Rán does not host feasts. Rán drags drowning men into her hall with a net, the Rán's net, which has become a kenning for the sea itself. She has gold and jewels scattered on the sea bottom, treasures that the drowned carry down to her. Together, Ægir and Rán capture the dual nature of the ocean, the hospitality and the annihilation, the feast hall and the tomb, the gift and the theft. Where Ægir provides abundance, Rán appropriates it. The two are inseparable, and the gods know both faces of the sea. Higher than Ægir and Rán in the hierarchy of cosmic forces are the Norns. They are 3 sisters, Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, and they dwell at the well of Urd, beneath the highest root of Yggdrasil itself. They are not gods in the way the Æsir are gods. They are something older and stranger. They carve the fates, the weird, of all beings, gods and men alike. They are the sovereigns of destiny itself. The very names encode their power. Urd is the past, what has already been. Verdandi is the present, what is becoming. Skuld is the future, what shall be. And the gods know this. They know that their daily council at the well of Urd is not a council of masters, but a council held at the pleasure of those who bind them to fate. Even Odin, even the All-Father, sits in deliberation beneath the weight of the Norns' knowledge. But beneath the 3 great Norns, Snorri tells us, there are many others. Snorri states that other Norns exist, lesser fate spirits, some descended from the Æsir, some from the elves, some from the dwarves. They come to every child at birth to shape its life, and a person's fortune depends on which kind of Norn attends their nativity. The Norns are not a fixed roster of 3. They are a whole uncounted class of beings, most of whom are not even named. The roster you think you know is a roster of only the most famous ones. Dozens of others, hundreds perhaps, shape the universe in silence, unnamed and largely unremembered. At the command of Odin and answerable to the Norns are the Valkyries. They are the choosers of the slain, women of divine power who ride to battlefields at Odin's direct command. They select which warriors will fall, and they bring the chosen dead to Valhalla, to the hall of the slain where the Einherjar feast and drink and prepare for the final battle. The Valkyries are the intersection of divine will and mortal death. They enact Odin's selection of fates in the blood and screaming of the battlefield, translating cosmic destiny into blood-soaked consequence. They are feminine divine agents wielding real power over life and death. They are not lesser beings, but essential operators of the cosmos's machinery. They serve drinks at the Einherjar's feasts and witness the gathering of the chosen dead. Higher still, in the very architecture of the cosmos, are the celestial powers. Sol is the sun, and she is a goddess, a woman who drives her chariot across the sky, carrying light to the world, but Sol is pursued. Behind her, always, comes the wolf Skjöll, hungering. And Sol knows that at Ragnarok, Skjöll will finally devour her and plunge the cosmos into darkness. Her brother is Mani, the god of the moon, also pursued by a wolf, Hati, and also doomed to be consumed at the end of the world. Both Sol and Mani are the twin engines of day and night, light and darkness. Both are vulnerable to the wolves chasing them, establishing that even the celestial fixed points, the things that seemed eternal, are subject to decay and death. The cosmos is structured by constant threat. Below them, in the cycle of days and nights, are Not and Dag. Not is the goddess of night, daughter of the giant Norvi. She drives her horse and chariot across the sky each night, carrying darkness, and her horse is named Hrimfaxi, the rime mane, because it foams with the rime of dawn. Not has a son named Dag, Day, who in turn drives the chariot of daylight. That Not and Dag are mother and son encodes the rhythm of the cosmos as genealogy. The passage from night to day is not a war, but a generational succession, the handing of power from mother to child. Time flows through kinship. Beneath even these is Njörðr. She is the goddess of the earth itself, the mother of Thor, and she is the ground beneath the 9 worlds. But Njörðr is barely attested. She appears as Thor's mother and as the physical ground of existence. But she has no narrative of her own in the myths recovered to us. Her role is structural, not narrative. She must exist for the cosmos to have a foundation. But the Icelanders who wrote these stories down did not preserve any tale of her actions or her speech. She is the foundation that is known to be there, but otherwise invisible. And then the names thin to almost nothing. Rind is an Aesir goddess, we are told, briefly in Snorri's list. She is the mother of Vali. Snorri reports that she is very beautiful, and there the attestation ends. One flattering sentence, and then silence. No narrative, no story of her agency or power. She exists as Vali's mother, and almost nowhere else. But there is another version. The Danish chronicler Saxo Grammaticus, writing around the same time as Snorri, tells an entirely different story of Rind. After Baldur's death, Odin travels in disguise to a Ruthenian princess named Rinda, taking on the form first of a warrior, then of a healer woman. Odin uses runic sorcery to drive Rinda mad, and then, disguised as her physician, he rapes her while she is bound to her sickbed. From this assault, a son is born, Baus, identified with Vali, the avenger of Baldur. Saxo's version is not flattering. It is brutal. It is a chronicle of Odin using his power to destroy a woman, to erase her consent, to use her body to produce the son he needs. Both are 13th century texts about the same goddess. Both claim to be drawing on ancient sources. Snorri's mythological register gives Rind one flattering sentence, while Saxo's euhemerized chronicle gives her a full, violent, named narrative in which Odin is unambiguously a rapist. Neither version is incomplete, Both are complete versions of what their traditions chose to preserve or omit. The silence of Snorri's register is not innocence. It is a choice to look away. Finally, there is Grid. She is named in Snorri's roster as an Æsir goddess. She is a goddess with almost no surviving myth. She appears only as a mother figure in fragmentary references, and even those are scanty. She is a name. She is a genealogical role, someone's mother. And then she is gone. She represents the nadir of what survived the passage from oral tradition to Christian Iceland. Grid is a deity preserved entirely through being someone else's mother, and almost nothing of her own power or story remains to us. And yet, the Norse understood that their roster was incomplete. In the poetic texts, Sul appears with a pan-Germanic parallel, the sun goddess Sunna of the 10th century Old High German healing charms, attested in a completely separate branch of Germanic tradition centuries before the Icelandic manuscripts. Sunna is not an Icelandic invention. She is direct comparative mythology evidence that a female sun deity is genuinely old, genuinely pan-Germanic, and not a late literary creation. One of the strongest anchors for treating Norse myth as a late written branch of a much older, wider tradition, rather than the tradition's origin point, is the fact that you can compare it to fragments of its cousins, preserved in other places, in other languages, in other texts, and find the same gods. But for every Sunna who is preserved across traditions, how many are entirely lost? How many Norns shaped the world in their own time without ever having a name written down? How many divine women had their stories told in the mead halls and the long nights, their names remembered and beloved, and then forgotten utterly? The 30 gods you are told about are not the pantheon the Norse knew. They are the pantheon that made it into parchment. They are the survivors. And at the edges of that roster, in the names with almost nothing behind them, you see the filter at work, the voices that were cut off, the stories that were lost, the gods whose worship faded, but whose names clung on, even if their narratives did not. We have walked the whole hall now. So it is time to answer the question we started with. How many of them are there really? We arrive now at the edge of what was written down, and the edge dissolves into fog. The gods we have traced sit at the high table with stories. They walk through the sagas with intent and consequence. But Snorri did not only name the rich and famous. He sat in his study in Iceland in the late 1200s and committed to parchment what he believed was the complete census of the Norse divine world. And when you read his lists, when you actually count the beings he named, something peculiar happens. The man who made the only systematic inventory of Norse divinity could not hold his own count in his head. Listen to what Snorri says. He writes outright in Gylfaginning, 12 eru Æsir godkunnigir. 12 are the divine Æsir. There it is, a clean stated boundary. 12, the sacred number. But then he turns the page and begins his enumeration, and the list grows. Odin, Thor, Balder, Njörðr, Freyja, Tyr, Bragi, Heimdallr, Herda, Vidar, Vali, Ullr, Forseti. That is 13, not 12. And then, pages later, he mentions Loki almost as an afterthought. Reckoned among them, he says. And so there are 14. The man who wrote down the Æsir could not count them. The boundary he drew himself did not hold. The goddesses get their own list. Snorri names them too in chapter 35. Frigg, Sága, Gefjun, Fulla, Freyja, Sjöfn, Lofn, Var, Vor, Hlín, Snotra and Gná. 14 beings named and placed in the divine hall. And so the 2 formal lists Snorri himself proclaimed as official. The 12, he said, the list he gave, the 14 goddesses, come to 28 when you add them together. 28, not 30, not the tidiest number, and not what the title of this very documentary claims. And here is where the thesis deepens. Some of the beings Snorri named have almost no story at all. Take Fjörgyn, also spelled Fjörgyn in some manuscripts. She appears in the sources without a clear face. Is she a goddess in her own right? Or is she a name, a variant, an epithet that later ages mistook for a being? The texts do not agree. Njörðr, the earth, is named outright as Thor's mother in some places, but elsewhere Fjörgyn holds the place, and in the poems a third name surfaces, Hlodin, used as if it means the same thing, the mother, the one who bore the thunder god, but never explained, never elaborated. One goddess, 3 names, or 3 goddesses, each of them half remembered. The source texts themselves do not tell us which. This is not a failure of scholarship. This is the record speaking the truth about itself. The transmission broke. Consider Njörðr. She appears in Snorri's list of the Æsir, the goddesses, in the Skaldskaparmal, that section where Snorri gathers the names of the divine ladies, their roles, their attributes. But Njörðr has no role given, no action, no story attached to her name. She is not described as the goddess of anything. She has no deed, no relationship, no myth. Snorri names her and moves on, and then, remarkably, her name surfaces one more time in the surviving poetry, in Alvismal, a riddling Eddic poem where the kenning Draum Njörðr, dream Njörðr, is used as a poetic term for a woman. One name, 2 places the name survives, 0 narrative, 0 myth, 0 personality. She is the roster's purest limit case, real enough to be written down, unknown enough that nothing about her exists except that she was. This is what the survivors list thesis looks like in its most extreme form, a goddess known only because her name survived, and that survival is the only proof that she ever mattered. So what is the true census? The answer depends entirely on where you draw the line, and that instability is the point. If you count only Snorri's 2 formal statements, the 12 Æsir he claimed, and the 14 Æsir he listed, you get 28 named deities. That is defensible. That is Snorri's own most conservative count of his own material. It falls short of 30. But it is what the man who wrote it down actually said were the core of the pantheon. If you widen the counting rule to include every being named in the primary sources, every Æsir, every Vanir, every goddess, and you add to those the beings who appear nowhere in Snorri's formal lists, but who nevertheless have personal names and personal actions in the myths, the count rises. Hönir, sent to the Vanir as surety in the settlement of the ancient war. Vili and Ve, Odin's brothers, who stood with him when the 3 of them shaped the world and breathed life into Ask and Embla. Modi and Magni, the sons of Thor, who will inherit his hammer when the fire comes. Hermoda, Odin's son, who rides Sleipnir down to Hel to plead for his brother Baldur's return. And Mímir, whose severed head guards the well of wisdom, still speaking counsel from death. These 7 alone, already missing from Snorri's formal rosters, but active and named in his own narrative, close the gap. Add them to the 28, and you approach 35 individual deities. A wider count, a defensible one. A count made by a plain rule, A being with a name and an action in the myths is a god of that pantheon, without inflating or inventing. But there are categories Snorri himself includes in the divine company that we deliberately do not count here. And the refusal itself teaches something. The Valkyries walk the battlefield and choose the slain. Snorri names some of them, 13 or more, each with her own name and function. They are divine servants, but they are not gods in the way the Æsir or the Vanir are gods. They are the Æsir's agents. To count them as deities in their own right would blur the hierarchy the myth depends on. Similarly, Ægir holds a divine hall and brews the mead of the gods, and the 9 daughters of Rán, his wife, the daughters of the sea, are named in the lists, but they too are functionaries, not independent divinities with their own domains and myths. And there are personified ideas and cosmic forces that have names and genealogies, but no narrative. Sul, who is the sun and drives the solar chariot. Mani, the moon, not the night. Dag, the day. Njörðr, the earth itself. They are beings in the sense that they can be named, can have parents, can be addressed, but they do not have myths. They do not act. They do not choose. They are the cosmos described, not the cosmos deciding. To count them would inflate the roster without giving us more gods. We would have more names, but no more presence in the space where the drama unfolds. So here is the honest census. If you count every being named in the prose Edda and the poetic Edda who has an independent role or action, a name and a deed, excluding the purely personified forces, excluding the giant brides and giant kin, you arrive at a defensible 30 to 35. You know 4 of them. The Edda's name, 30. And that number sits between the 2 counts we have just walked through, neither invented nor overstated. 30 is the count you get when you refuse to cheat, when you count plain and honest, when you draw a line and defend it. But here is the ultimate lesson. Across Scandinavia, in the place names of the land, in the amulets worn around necks, in the personal names given to children, Thor appears more often than any other god. Worship on the ground favored the thunder god. The Christian chronicler Adam of Bremen, writing in the late 11th century, visiting Uppsala and seeing the great temple with its golden statues, reported 3 gods of supreme rank: Odin at one end, Freyja at the other, and Thor in the center. Thor in the center, the local god, the god who protected the harvest and the home, the god the people knew. Yet in the Eddic texts, the texts that survived, the texts that were written down, Odin dominates. Odin the wanderer, the seeker, the one who made sacrifices to gain wisdom and power. Odin the poet god, honored by the court poets, whose verse was worth writing down and preserving. The texts we have were written by the scribes of kings and poets. The gods they cared about were the gods of ambition and eloquence and cosmic knowledge. And so Thor, the true god of the people, the one they actually invoked for rain and safety, was demoted to a supporting role in the only surviving manuscript of divine legend. This is the survivor's list thesis in its purest form. The roster we inherited is not the pantheon the Norse people lived with. It is the pantheon the Christian scribe Snorri judged worth preserving. And even he could not count it straight. They have been counted, now they have to be spent. And then the cosmos ends. But it does not end in chaos. It ends as a ritual. All beings in their appointed places converge on the field. The plain is called Vigridr. It is vast, 500 leagues in every direction, though no measurement can really hold it. It is a space assembled for witness, not a battlefield of the old kind, where one side wins and the other falls away. Everyone comes. The Einherjar, the honored dead who have trained for this through the ages, march from Valhalla, row from Muspel. Surt the fire giant leads the forces of burning. Heimdallr and Loki, ancient enemies from the first war, meet at last, and they slay each other. No victor. The two end together. The Gjallarhorn sounds. Heimdallr blows the horn one final time. The sound carries to every world, and in that moment, all beings know the end has come. The sky tears open, the earth trembles and sinks into the sea. The stars vanish from the heavens, the sun turns black. But before the darkness closes, one god acts. Vidar, the son of Odin, strides forward to the wolf Fenrir as it breaks its bonds and opens its jaws to swallow the cosmos. The wolf has killed his father, and Vidar places his foot on the lower jaw of Fenrir, the god's foot upon the mouth of the beast, and he tears the jaws apart. It is not a victory. It is a vengeance enacted in the midst of catastrophe, an act that happens inside the ending rather than preventing it. Vidar does this. Vidar survives. The sun endures, and Thor's sons stand in that same field. Modi and Magni, their names mean rage and might, and they have trained in the shadow of their father's combats all through the age of the world. When Thor falls fighting the Midgard serpent, when the serpent's venom sprays and the sky roars apart, Modi and Magni claim their inheritance. They take Mjolnir, the hammer their father has wielded since the beginning of time. The hammer does not burn in the fire of Surt. The hammer survives, and Modi and Magni carry it forward into the world that comes after, into the plain that will be called Ida's Field, where the new cosmos will grow green. The hammer passes from one generation to the next. Order is renewed not because the old order did not end, but because something is carried through, and Baldur returns, the most beautiful god, the one slain at the height of his power, the god whose death broke the Æsir and set in motion all the griefs and grudges of the age, walks out of hell. He is radiant. He is alive. His companion Hödr comes with him. Hödr, the blind god, the one whose hand threw the mistletoe branch that killed Baldur, though not by his own will or knowledge. Hödr and Baldur, killer and killed, emerge together into the renewed cosmos, reconciled in a world where that old enmity no longer holds weight. The restoration of Baldur is the great reversal written into the deepest structure of Norse myth, that nothing beautiful is lost forever, that death is not the final word even for the gods. And yet, even as we stand in that field and watch this renewal, even as we see the gods who inherit the next age walk forward, the texture of the source texts reminds us of the incompleteness we have traced through this entire pantheon. Thor, the greatest, the most widely worshipped among actual people, the god on whose shoulders cosmic order most visibly rested. We do not fully know even his mother. In the stanza that records his death at Ragnarok, fighting the Midgard serpent, the poet names him with 3 different matronymics within a handful of lines. Fjörgen's son, Hladin's son. Different names, each used as if it were the obvious one, with no explanation of which is primary or whether they are even the same being. It is as if the poet, or the transmitters of the poem, no longer remembered whether these were variants or distinct goddesses, and solved the problem by using all 3, as if repetition might somehow secure the memory. One mother, 3 names, or 3 mothers, each half forgotten. The record itself carries the fracture. This is what the divine society looks like at the very end of all things. They have been fractured families. Æsir and Vanir once at war, now bound by marriage and hostage oath. They have been marked by loss, Baldur slain, Odin devoured by Fenrir, Thor struck dead by the serpent's venom. They have been defined by absences, gods known only by name, goddesses attached to no story, a pantheon that never had a chance to be complete because it was written down late, filtered through Christian scribes, and transmitted only where the written word could carry it. And still they walk, still they gather on the field, still they act. Vidar tears open the jaws of the beast, Modi and Magni raise the hammer, Baldur returns from death. The cosmos does not renew because the Æsir are perfect or all-knowing. It renews because this fractured, incompletely known, half-remembered collection of beings continues to move through the moment of ending, each playing the role that was written for them long ago, in that first moment when Odin and his brothers took the body of Ymir and made the worlds from his flesh. The divine society at Vigrid is not triumphant. It is not saved, but it is not erased either. Some gods survive, some inheritances pass forward, some beautiful things return. The catalogue of the known and the unknown, the named and the nameless, the remembered and the forgotten, walks together into the field and waits to see what the new world will be.